When you think of a medieval monastery, perhaps you imagine rows of men in habits chanting psalms, their voices echoing beneath the vaulted stone ceilings of a church. But behind the great halls and cloisters was a quieter world, one that rarely finds its way into history books: the dormitories. These were the long, simple rooms where monks slept, side by side, night after night for decades on end. Unlike the dramatic accounts of medieval battles or royal courts, the story of a monk's night in the dormitory seems dull at first glance, yet within the stillness of those stone-walled chambers lay an entire world of discipline, discomfort, and small repetitive struggles that defined daily life in the cloister. You are invited to step into that room. The air is damp, carrying the faint scent of wool, straw, and stone. Rows of narrow beds stretch out, separated sometimes by wooden partitions, but often just lined up along the walls. Privacy was not encouraged in monastic life. The body was a vessel to be disciplined, not indulged. The dormitory was a space where individuality dissolved into the collective rhythm of the community. At night, each monk lay down on his straw mattress, fully clothed in his habit, ready to rise at the toll of the bell no matter the hour. The silence of the dormitory was not merely practical, it was sacred. Most monasteries followed the rule of St. Benedict, which placed a deep emphasis on silence. Words were limited, speech was measured, and even in the dormitory whispers were rare. If a monk stirred restlessly on his straw, if he shifted or coughed, he became keenly aware of the presence of dozens of brothers around him, each one striving to surrender himself to quiet. The sound of breathing, the creak of beds, the occasional snore, these were the nocturnal soundtrack of the cloister. Yet, within such restraint, the monks believed that the silence itself was a form of prayer, as if each unspoken word brought them closer to God. But silence had its practical uses as well. Without silence, the room would have been chaotic. Imagine a group of men, dozens, sometimes hundreds in the larger monasteries, living in close quarters, day and night. Any lack of order could break the fragile rhythm of communal living. By enforcing silence, the rule ensured that the focus remained inward, not outward, even as the monks lay shoulder to shoulder in their nightly rest. The beds themselves were as plain as the rest of monastic life. Some monasteries provided simple wooden frames with straw mattresses, while poorer houses had nothing more than a layer of straw on the floor. Blankets were coarse wool, often woven within the monastery itself. Each monk was expected to keep only what was absolutely necessary, and comfort was viewed with suspicion. There were no pillows, no sheets, no indulgence in softness. The physical austerity of the dormitory was meant to discipline the body, to remind the monk that his flesh was weak, that life was temporary, and that heaven, not the comfort of earthly bedding, was the true goal. The architecture of the dormitory reflected this discipline. The room was typically large, rectangular, and lined with narrow windows, their light barely reaching the corners. Stone walls absorbed the cold in winter, making the air harsh and unwelcoming. During summer, the air grew stifling, especially when packed with so many men sleeping in close proximity. And yet, this was accepted without complaint. Endurance was part of the training of the soul. A monk's ability to sleep amid discomfort was itself considered a form of spiritual exercise. But the dormitory was not just a place for sleep. It was part of a larger rhythm of time that structured every moment of monastic life. A monk never went to bed without knowing that he would be woken during the night. The bell, the ever-present symbol of the monastery, governed their rest as much as their prayers. At the appointed hour, often around 2 a.m, the bell would toll, summoning the community to matins, the night office of prayer. Imagine it. In the still darkness, the sound of iron against iron echoing through the stone corridors, pulling every man from his slumber. One by one, monks would stir, rise, and shuffle silently toward the church. Sleep was broken, but discipline demanded obedience. This constant interruption of sleep made monastic rest unlike anything you know today. Monks did not expect a full night's sleep. Instead, they slept in intervals, their rest broken by prayer, their bodies trained to accept the fatigue as part of their devotion. Modern readers might imagine exhaustion, but for the monks, fatigue was a natural part of life. To be tired was to be human. To endure weariness in prayer was to imitate Christ's endurance of suffering. In this way, even the most mundane fact of the dormitory, that it was a place of broken sleep, carried deep spiritual significance. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century, had precise instructions for these nights. It dictated when the monks should rise, how many psalms should be recited, and even how quickly they should move to the church. Sleep was permitted but never indulged. Sloth was a sin, and idleness a danger. The dormitory, then, was not just a bedroom. It was a testing ground, where each monk's devotion was measured in the silent hours of the night, in the obedience to the bell, and in the willingness to surrender the body's desire for rest. And yet, despite all the discipline, human weakness always crept in. Records from monastic chroniclers reveal complaints about snoring brothers, about the cold that made sleep nearly impossible, about infestations of lice and fleas that tormented the monks as they lay in their straw. Some monasteries even had rules against turning over too noisily in bed, for fear of disturbing others. Imagine the small frustrations. A restless brother shifting again and again, another coughing with a lingering illness, another whispering prayers aloud when silence was expected. Such details may seem trivial, but they remind us that these monks were not ethereal beings. They were men, struggling with the same discomforts that still haunt human sleep today. But perhaps the strangest detail of all was the way the dormitory shaped the monk's sense of time. Sleep was never complete, always fractured, always subject to the demands of the rule. In a world without clocks as we know them, time was measured by bells, by the moon, by the slow burning of candles. To lie in the dormitory at night was to be suspended between two worlds, the world of rest and the world of prayer, the world of the body and the world of the spirit. And in that suspension, the monk learned patience, humility, and endurance. As you imagine yourself lying in that stone chamber, you might wonder, what was it like to surrender so completely to routine? To live night after night with no privacy, no indulgence, and no certainty of uninterrupted rest? Could the silence of the dormitory truly bring peace? Or did it sometimes feel like a weight pressing down, heavier than the stone walls themselves? If Section 1 showed you the stillness of the monastic dormitory, Section 2 will take you deeper into the rhythm that defined those nights, the cycle of broken sleep and midnight rising. For a monk, the dormitory was not a place of rest in the modern sense, but a station in the endless march of discipline. To sleep was never the final goal. It was merely an interlude before the bell called again. The heart of this rhythm was the office of matins, sometimes called vigils. It was the night prayer, the breaking of sleep for the sake of devotion. The rule of St. Benedict required monks to rise in the middle of the night, no matter the season, to chant psalms and recite readings. In the summer months this might mean rising when the sky was already hinting at dawn, but in the deep of winter it meant leaving a cold bed in the pitch black of night. Imagine the sound. The bell tolls in the silence, echoing against the stone. Monks stir, groan softly, pull their heavy wool habits tighter, and step from their straw beds into the chill. The air bites at their skin, but the rule demands obedience, not comfort. The journey from dormitory to church was short but significant. Some monasteries built the dormitory directly above the cloister, with a staircase leading straight into the church so that the monks could move swiftly, silently, in single file. The architecture itself reflected devotion. There was no excuse for delay, no opportunity for distraction. The monk passed from bed to prayer with only a few steps between, and when they entered the dark church, the night seemed to shift. The stillness of the dormitory gave way to the murmured rhythm of psalms rising in unison. But what did this do to their bodies? Modern sleep scientists might call it segmented sleep. Rhythm once common before industrialization. People slept in two parts, with a wakeful period in the middle of the night. Monks, however, formalized this natural rhythm into discipline. They woke not by choice but by command, turning the body's restless hours into hours of worship. Their lives became a testament to the belief that prayer mattered more than rest. Even in the coldest nights of December, when fatigue pulled heavily at their bodies, they rose. The accounts of chroniclers tell us that fatigue was ever present. Some monks nodded off during prayer, heads drooping, voices trailing. The rule itself warns against drowsiness and instructs monks to sit upright, attentive, alert as best they could. Yet it was inevitable. exhaustion seeped into the rhythm of their days. The dormitory, with its straw beds and wool blankets, never offered full relief. By dawn, when others outside the cloister still slept, the monks had already prayed for hours. Their bodies carried that weight through the day, sustained not by comfort but by routine. And yet, it was believed that this discipline bore fruit. The midnight prayers connected the monks to the divine order of the universe. Rising in darkness mirrored the resurrection, a reminder that light follows night. It was not just fatigue, it was a symbol. The breaking of sleep became an act of humility, a surrender of the body's demands to the higher call of devotion. In this way, the silence of the dormitory was broken not by chatter, but by the toll of the bell, the voice of God's order calling them back to duty. The cycle repeated night after night for decades of a monk's life. This constancy shaped not just the individual but the entire community. In the dormitory, no man's life was his own. Each brother's rest was bound to the rhythm of all. If one monk faltered, the rest carried him forward. If one resisted, discipline demanded correction. The dormitory was not a sanctuary from others, but a reminder that one lived always in community, never alone. Even the act of sleeping was communal, governed by the same rules, subject to the same interruptions. There were, of course, small variations across monasteries. The Cistercians, known for their austerity, often had open dormitories with rows of beds and no partitions at all. Cluniac houses, wealthier and more elaborate, sometimes allowed for greater comfort, with more substantial bedding and a bit of separation between brothers. But the principle remained the same. Sleep was not for indulgence. It was a tool, a necessity, never an end. Whether in stone chambers in France or wooden houses in England, the life of the dormitory carried the same burden of obedience. Consider also the seasons. In winter, the cold was relentless. Fires were rarely permitted in dormitories, as they were considered a temptation to luxury. Monks endured freezing air, waking with numb hands and stiff joints, their breath visible in the darkness. In summer, the heat could be suffocating, with dozens of bodies packed close together, the air thick and stale. And yet, through it all, the bell still tolled, the rule still commanded, and the monks still rose. These discomforts were not excuses, they were part of the path to holiness. The dormitory was also where sickness became visible. A sick brother, coughing through the night, reminded all of the fragility of flesh. There were no separate hospitals for minor ailments. The dormitory itself was a place where the sick and the healthy shared space, where weakness was borne communally. In larger monasteries, infirmaries existed for serious illness, but for everyday coughs, aches, or lingering fevers, the dormitory carried those burdens together. In this way, the silence was sometimes broken by the sounds of suffering, and patience was tested in the long hours of darkness. Yet there were hidden rhythms of solace as well. Some monks reported finding peace in the night hours, when the dormitory was still and the mind could wander toward reflection. Though silence was enforced, prayer was never forbidden. Many monks used the wakeful moments of the night to whisper psalms silently to themselves, to repeat memorized scripture, or to turn over sermons in their minds. The dormitory was, in its own way, a place of meditation. The body might lie weary on the straw, but the soul could still rise toward contemplation. This balance between burden and solace made the dormitory a paradox. It was uncomfortable, but it was also formative. It was dull, yet it shaped entire lives. In the silence, monks learned patience. In the fatigue, they learned humility. In the broken rhythm of their nights, they found a deeper connection to God. And it is here that we begin to see why even the most mundane detail, the fact that monks rose in the middle of the night, slept on straw, and shared the same room for decades, was considered significant. To them, it was not boring. It was salvation lived out in silence and repetition. But as you imagine those long sleepless nights, you might ask yourself, did the silence always bring peace, or did it sometimes bring doubt? In the darkness, when the bell had not yet rung, and the body ached for rest, did some monks wonder if the discipline truly led them closer to God? Or did the silence of the dormitory sometimes echo with unspoken questions too heavy to be voiced? By now you have walked through the stillness of the dormitory and the discipline of broken sleep. In this final section, we look at what this life meant, not just for the monks themselves, but for the broader culture of medieval Europe. For though the dormitory seems like a place of mere rest, It was in fact a crucible of values, shaping the men who shaped the world outside the cloister walls. To begin, you must understand that the monks' dormitory was more than architecture. It was a symbol of the collective life, a silent sermon made of stone and straw. In a world where most people slept, in cottages with family members, servants or livestock, the monastic dormitory stood apart. Here was a community stripped of kinship ties, bound not by blood but by a rule. To sleep beside dozens of others, night after night, was to surrender individuality for fraternity. The dormitory represented obedience, humility, and the breaking of pride, qualities that monasteries prized above all. The impact of this discipline reached far beyond the walls. Monasteries were not isolated islands, even if they seemed remote. They were landowners, economic centres, places of learning and nodes of spiritual authority. The monks who rose in the middle of the night, who endured cold straw beds, were the same men who managed estates, copied manuscripts, educated novices, and advised kings. Their nights of fatigue shaped their days of influence. The discipline of the dormitory flowed outward, subtly, into the larger rhythm of medieval society. Consider too how the monastic dormitory shaped ideas of time. Outside the cloister, peasants measured time by the sun, by the rhythm of the seasons, by the demands of agriculture. But inside the monastery, time was measured by bells, by the division of the night, by the precise schedule of prayers. This strict measurement of hours would eventually influence the broader culture. Monasteries preserved and advanced systems of timekeeping, maintaining the knowledge of calendars and celestial observation. The simple act of waking at matins helped cement the idea that time could, and should, be divided, ordered and controlled. In this sense, the dormitory's midnight summons had ripples far beyond prayer. The very architecture of dormitories spread across Europe as monastic orders expanded. The Benedictines, the Cistercians, the Cluniacs. Each order carried its own interpretation of communal sleep. When new monasteries were built, architects planned dormitories not as afterthoughts, but as central features. Some were vast, with high vaulted ceilings, others simple wooden halls, but all carried the same message. Here, men surrendered private rest for collective discipline. The dormitory became as much a symbol of monastic life as the cloister or the refectory. It is worth remembering, however, that the dormitory was not without its tensions. Chroniclers left behind glimpses of discontent. Complaints of brothers who snored too loudly, who coughed through the night, who turned in bed too often. Some abbots issued rules about posture, requiring monks to sleep clothed on their backs, hands crossed upon the chest in imitation of burial. Others warned against whispering in the dark. These may seem small matters, but they reveal the delicate balance of community life. In silence, every sound became noticeable. In proximity, every habit became magnified. The dormitory tested patience as much as it tested obedience. And yet, despite these tensions, many monks found meaning in the very discomforts of their nights. To endure cold, to endure fatigue, was to share in the suffering of Christ. To accept the imperfections of others was to practice charity. To obey the bell in darkness was to submit to God's will. The dormitory became not just a place of sleep, but a school of virtue. Its silence was not empty. It was filled with lessons, whispered in the spaces between breaths, taught in the creak of beds and the echo of bells. Over time, this way of life also left its imprint on spirituality. The idea of vigilance, the readiness to wake in the night, to resist the body's pull towards slumber, became central to Christian devotion. The dormitory embodied vigilance. It taught monks that the spiritual life required wakefulness, not just in body but in soul. To fall asleep too deeply was to risk spiritual negligence. To rise promptly was to show faithfulness. In this way, the discipline of the dormitory echoed the larger message of monasticism, to stay awake, in every sense, to the presence of God. Outside the monastery, ordinary people may have viewed such discipline with awe, perhaps even with confusion. To the peasant labourer, already weary from the fields, the idea of rising at midnight to pray must have seemed impossible. To the noble, sleeping in feather beds and comfort, the straw of the dormitory was a sign of radical humility. But both peasants and nobles respected the monks, seeing in their discipline a spiritual authority that justified the monastery's role in society. The dormitory's silence, though hidden, contributed to the respect and even the mystique that surrounded monastic communities. And so we find ourselves returning to the beginning, to the silence of the dormitory itself. It is easy, in the modern world, to overlook such a place. To our eyes it may seem dull, repetitive, even oppressive. What lesson could possibly lie in rows of straw beds and the toll of a bell at midnight? Yet the monks believed those nights shaped their souls. They believed that silence was not emptiness, but fullness, that obedience was not bondage, but freedom. In the stone chambers of the dormitory, under the weight of silence and fatigue, they found the path they believed led to eternity. As you imagine those monks lying side by side, night after night, you might ask yourself, what does silence mean to you? Could you, in a world filled with noise, endure such stillness? Could you rise from your bed at midnight, again and again, without question, for the sake of discipline and devotion? Or does the dormitory remain for us a relic of another age, a reminder that even the dullest details of history can still challenge the way we think about our own lives? In dim stone cloisters, monks whispered numbers to sheep passing fields, weaving gentle rhythms of faith and rest into their long medieval nights. When you hear the phrase, counting sheep, perhaps you imagine it as a modern cliché, a mental trick whispered to restless minds who cannot fall asleep. But for medieval monks, the act of counting sheep was not merely a metaphor. In some monasteries, it was a literal part of life. Sheep were central to monastic economies, their wool fueling trade, their presence shaping landscapes, and their numbers carefully tallied by brothers whose days and nights were governed by prayer and duty. For monks, counting sheep was not only a chore but a form of discipline, a small act in the grand routine that blended the sacred with the mundane. Imagine a monk at the end of a long day. He has risen in the dark hours for matins, chanted psalms, worked in the fields, copied lines of scripture by flickering candlelight, and returned again and again to the chapel at the toll of the bell. As the sun sets, he takes one final task, to tend to the sheep in the monastery's pasture. The animals move slowly across the meadow, their wool thick, their hooves pressing into the damp soil. The monk counts them patiently, 27, 28, 29. Each number murmured softly under his breath, not unlike a prayer. To him, the flock is not merely livestock, it is a trust. Each sheep represents warmth for the cloister in winter, income for trade, sustenance for the poor. To miscount would not only risk material loss, but spiritual neglect. In counting sheep, he fulfills a duty to God as much as to the abbey. Sheep had always been central to monastic life in Europe. From the early medieval period onward, monasteries controlled vast estates, and flocks were among their most valuable assets. Wool was a cornerstone of the medieval economy, especially in regions like England, Flanders, and parts of France and Spain. Monasteries supplied much of this wool, their sheep grazing on lands donated by kings, nobles, and local lords. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Cistercian houses in particular were renowned for the quality of their wool, which was sold to merchants across the continent. To manage these flocks, monks relied on lay brothers and shepherds, but the counting of sheep remained a symbolic and often literal part of monastic routine. And so, as strange as it may sound, counting sheep became both a spiritual metaphor and a practical task. Each number was a measure of vigilance, of stewardship, of attention to detail. The rule of St. Benedict instructed monks to care for the goods of the monastery as if they were sacred vessels of the altar. A sheep was not just an animal, it was part of God's creation entrusted to human care. To count sheep was to acknowledge responsibility, to show that nothing was too small or too ordinary to be folded into the rhythm of devotion. At night, when the monk lay down on his straw bed, the rhythm of counting might return to his mind. The day's tally lingered, the number of sheep recited again in memory. In the stillness of the dormitory where silence was required, the act of mentally repeating those numbers could soothe a restless body. Though unintentional, this may well have been an early form of the practice we know today, counting sheep to fall asleep. The mind, anchored by repetition, eased itself toward rest. For the medieval monk, the numbers carried not only rhythm but meaning. Each sheep was tied to the livelihood of the monastery, the warmth of the cloister, the service of God. This connection between sheep and sleep also reached into the symbolic. Sheep were not just animals, they were deeply biblical creatures. Christ himself was the Good Shepherd, and his followers were his flock. The psalms, chanted endlessly in the monastery, spoke of sheep led to green pastures, of lambs sacrificed, of shepherds guiding their flocks through the valley of death. To count sheep, then, was never a purely secular act. Every number reminded the monk of scripture, of parables, of his place within the divine order. In the silence of the dormitory, when the mind wandered, the image of sheep could easily slip into prayer. But counting sheep was not always a soothing task. It was at times a burden. Flocks had to be checked daily, especially in monasteries with hundreds of animals. Disease could sweep through a flock, wiping out wool and income. Wolves lurked at the edges of fields, and thieves could steal in the night. The shepherd's vigilance became a form of protection, and monks who counted sheep did so with a sense of anxiety as well as devotion. Each tally was a check against loss, against failure, against shame. To fall asleep uncertain of the number could gnaw at the conscience, pulling the mind back again and again until rest finally came. The landscape itself carried the sound of sheep. In the green hills around abbeys, the bleating of flocks was constant, blending with the toll of bells and the chant of psalms. Monks lived in a world where sound and silence coexisted. Chant in the chapel, silence in the dormitory, bleats in the fields. To count sheep was to order this sound, to impose human measure upon the chaos of nature. It was a reminder that even in the quietest hours of night, life outside the dormitory continued, and the care of creation remained an unending responsibility. What we often dismiss as a simple cliché, counting sheep to fall asleep, was, in medieval monastic life, both literal and profound. It was an act of stewardship, an economic necessity, a spiritual metaphor, and perhaps even a comfort in restless hours. The monk who lay on his straw bed, whispering numbers in his mind, was not indulging in a childish trick. He was continuing the day's duty, folding the care of sheep into the silence of night, blending the material and the spiritual into one unbroken rhythm. Yet we must pause and ask, did this act truly bring peace? Did the monk repeating numbers in the darkness find his body slipping into rest? Or did the burden of responsibility weigh heavier, keeping him awake long after the dormitory had fallen silent? If Section 1 placed you beside the monk quietly counting his flock, Section 2 widens the view. Counting sheep was not only a nighttime ritual or a pastoral task, it was the foundation of one of the most powerful economic engines of medieval Europe. To understand why monks literally counted sheep, you must look at the wool trade and the extraordinary role monasteries played in shaping it. By the 12th century, wool was wealth. Europe's growing towns, especially in Flanders and northern Italy, demanded fine wool for cloth. Merchants built fortunes on it, kings taxed it, and monasteries supplied it. English wool in particular was prized for its quality, and Cistercian abbeys in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and the Cotswolds became synonymous with large-scale sheep farming. When you imagine a monk counting sheep in the twilight fields, you are not picturing a quaint pastime. You're witnessing the first step in a global trade network that stretched from the abbey pasture to the cloth halls of Bruges and Florence. Monasteries had unique advantages. They controlled vast tracts of land, often granted by pious nobles seeking spiritual favour. They had lay brothers, men who joined the monastery not as choir monks but as workers, who tended fields, managed flocks, and oversaw production. They had the discipline of order, the written records to keep track of inventories, and the stability of institutions that outlived individual lifetimes. Where peasants might struggle with small herds, monasteries managed thousands of sheep at once, their wealth multiplying as wool poured into Europe's markets. And so the act of counting sheep became an act of accounting. Monks did not merely tally animals in a field, they recorded numbers in parchment ledgers, tracked lambing rates, noted losses to disease, and calculated yields of wool. Some abbeys employed cellars and bursars specifically tasked with overseeing economic affairs, and sheep figures filled their reports. The rhythm of numbers was as constant as the rhythm of prayer. Each spring after shearing, the weight of wool was measured carefully, bundles marked for trade. Without precise counting, chaos would unravel the system. One missing sheep meant lost wool, lost income, perhaps even suspicion of theft. Counting was vigilance. It was economy. It was survival. The importance of sheep to monasteries can be measured by the architecture they funded. Towering Gothic churches, cloisters carved with delicate stone, vast libraries filled with manuscripts. Many of these were built with wool money. A simple flock of sheep, tended and counted by patient monks, helped finance some of Europe's most enduring cultural treasures. When you look at the vaulted ceilings of a Cistercian abbey, you're looking at stone shaped by wool. Counting sheep in a muddy field was not detached from grandeur, it was the hidden root of it. But this wealth also created tension. Critics accused monasteries of becoming too entangled in commerce, too focused on profit. Some monks themselves worried that the pursuit of wool corrupted the spirit of poverty. The tension between spiritual devotion and economic success haunted monastic orders, particularly the Cistercians, who began as reformers committed to simplicity, but soon became some of Europe's wealthiest landowners. Counting sheep in this light was not only an act of stewardship, but a test of conscience. Was it prayer or was it profit? Could one serve God while tallying flocks for market gain? Daily life reflected this duality. A monk in the dormitory might drift asleep with numbers in his head, but by day those same numbers appeared in contracts with merchants, in negotiations with royal officials, in disputes over pasture rights. The sheep that grazed peacefully outside the cloister were part of a vast network of trade and politics. Wool exports funded wars, fed economies, and bound monasteries to the fate of kingdoms. The quiet act of counting sheep echoed all the way to the throne rooms of Europe. Even beyond wealth, sheep shaped landscapes. Monasteries cleared forests to create pasture land, altering ecosystems in ways still visible today. Hillsides that once held dense woods became open fields dotted with flocks. Rivers once shaded by trees were exposed to sun. The bleating of sheep replaced the calls of woodland animals. Counting sheep was not only economic but environmental. Each tally represented a change in land use, a reshaping of the world to suit the needs of wool. And yet, within the monastery, the act remained humble. Brothers rose from their beds, pulled on their habits, and walked the fields to count and tend the flock. They recorded numbers with quill pens, ink staining their fingers. They weighed wool in stone barns, the air thick with lanolin. For all its vast consequences, the daily labour looked ordinary, repetitive, almost dull. And that is the paradox of history. The boring details of counting sheep built cathedrals, fueled economies, and altered landscapes. The metaphor of sheep also seeped into sermons and writings. Monks wrote of themselves as shepherds, of souls as flocks, of vigilance in counting as vigilance in guiding. To count sheep was to practice care, not just for animals but for people. The same discipline that tallied flocks in fields also shaped the care of novices in the cloister, the attention to detail in manuscripts, the vigilance in prayer. Numbers became symbols, carrying lessons from pasture to chapel. Just as no sheep was to be lost, so too no soul was to be neglected. Yet, beneath this harmony, the questions lingered. Did monasteries lose their purity in their pursuit of wool? Did the counting of sheep bind them too closely to worldly wealth? Could silence in the dormitory truly coexist with contracts in the marketplace? These unresolved tensions gave monastic life its contradictions: discipline and wealth, humility and grandeur, silence and commerce. And so, as you picture the monk in his dormitory drifting to sleep with numbers in his head, you must also picture the merchant in Bruges unrolling wool bales, the king in Westminster taxing exports, the mason carving stone for an abbey church, all connected to that humble act of counting sheep. The numbers whispered in the silence of the night echoed across Europe, shaping history in ways the monk himself may never have imagined. But pause and consider, did the monk know? As he counted, as he lay down on straw repeating numbers in the dark, did he realise that his small boring act was tied to cathedrals, kingdoms and trade routes? Or did he think only of the flock before him, never seeing how far the ripples of his count would spread? The picture of a monk slowly counting sheep in a pasture or whispering numbers in the dormitory may feel small, almost trivial. But history often hides its most enduring legacies in these small details. In this final section, we follow the thread from medieval monastic fields to the modern cliché of counting sheep as a way to fall asleep, and we ask what this legacy tells us about the endurance of boring history. The medieval monastery was a world of numbers. Psalms were numbered, prayers were ordered, bells marked hours, and sheep were tallied. Counting was a rhythm of life, and within it the monk found both devotion and duty. By turning the act of counting sheep into a nightly habit, monks blurred the line between economy and spirituality. Each number was practical. It ensured no animal was missing, but also symbolic, echoing the shepherd imagery that ran deep in Christian scripture. Christ was the good shepherd. The faithful were his sheep. To count sheep was, in some sense, to practice theology with numbers. Over time, the act of counting sheep may have slipped into the imagination of ordinary people as well. Shepherds across Europe, not just monks, relied on tallies to manage their flocks. The repetition of numbers murmured under one's breath naturally lent itself to drowsiness. For peasants and monks alike, it was easy to imagine drifting into sleep with the steady rhythm of counting, 27, 28, 29. In a world before clocks, before artificial light, before modern sleep science, the human mind grasped at repetition as a way to bridge wakefulness and rest. Counting sheep was not invented in the modern era. It was remembered. The metaphor grew stronger because sheep carried such weight in medieval thought. They were not merely animals, they were symbols of purity, sacrifice, and community. To imagine sheep while falling asleep was not absurd. It was fitting. The very act of being a sheep in Christ's flock suggested trust, surrender, rest under the shepherd's care. In monasteries, where scripture was sung daily, this symbolism could not be avoided. Counting sheep in the silence of the dormitory was not only a way to ease the mind, it was a way to frame rest as part of devotion. Sleep itself became a small act of trust. But history never stands still. As the Middle Ages passed into the Renaissance and beyond, the economic power of monasteries waned. Wars, reforms, and secularization broke many abbeys, scattering flocks and ending centuries of wool dominance. Yet the memory of monks and their sheep lingered. Stories of monastic wealth, of cloisters filled with wool, of fields covered in flocks survived in chronicles and folk memory. The image of monks counting sheep passed into culture, slowly transformed into metaphor. What had once been a literal task became a story people told about sleep. By the early modern period, manuals on sleep and dreams occasionally reference counting as a technique for calming the mind. The association with sheep was natural. They were gentle, familiar, and already tied to the rhythms of night and pasture. Over generations, the connection hardened into the phrase we know today, count sheep to fall asleep. Few remembered that it was once a literal monastic duty. Fewer still recalled the long nights of silence and stone dormitories where numbers carried both burden and comfort. Yet the cliché endured, proof that boring details of history sometimes outlive grand events. What does this tell us? That culture often preserves the ordinary even when it forgets the extraordinary. Kings fell, wars raged, empires collapsed, but the image of counting sheep survived. It is as if history whispered, the way people slept, the way they measured time, the way they calmed restless minds mattered as much as battles and crowns. The monks who whispered numbers in the dark, who carried flocks in their care, left a legacy not of conquest but of habit. And that habit in its simplicity still touches us when we lie awake at night. The enduring cliché also reminds us of the link between economy and imagination. Counting sheep was practical because wool was wealth. It was soothing because sheep were everywhere, on hillsides, in villages, in scripture. Without the monastic wool trade, without the vast fields of Europe dotted with flocks, the metaphor might never have taken root. The boredom of counting sheep became powerful only because sheep mattered deeply to medieval life. The metaphor we inherit today is a shadow of that reality, stripped of its economic weight but still carrying its symbolic calm. And so we return to the dormitory. Picture again the monk lying on his straw mattress, the silence thick around him, the faint sound of breathing from dozens of brothers beside him. His body is weary, his mind restless. He recalls the flock from the fields, 27, 28, 29, and lets the numbers carry him into sleep. For him, this is duty, memory, devotion. For us, centuries later, it is a cliché. Yet in both cases, the rhythm is the same. Repetition, surrender, the slow fading of wakefulness into rest. Perhaps that is the real legacy of counting sheep. It is not just a trick of the mind, it is a memory of history. When you lie awake and repeat numbers in your head, you're not inventing something new, you're echoing centuries of habit, whispering with monks and shepherds long gone, joining in a rhythm that stretched from medieval pastures to modern bedrooms. The boring detail becomes the timeless connection. But here is the question that lingers. When you count sheep tonight, will you remember that it was once a sacred duty, a symbol of devotion, an echo of woolen prayer? Or will it remain for you just a cliché, a trick for sleep, detached from the silent dormitories where it all began? In hushed cloisters, midnight candles wept wax upon stone as monks kept silent watch. Time marked by shadows, prayers, and the echo of bells. If you imagine a medieval monastery at night, you might picture silence and stillness, a dormitory of monks lying on straw beds, the air filled with the faint sound of breathing. But step beyond the dormitory door into the cloister, the covered walkway that wrapped around the monastery's inner courtyard, and you would find another kind of night scene. Pools of flickering candlelight, the faint smell of tallow or beeswax, the shuffle of sandaled feet, and the long, patient vigil of monks keeping watch. These were the midnight watches, small acts of devotion and duty, illuminated by candles whose drippings mark the passing hours. Candles were not luxuries in monasteries, they were necessities. Darkness fell early in medieval Europe, especially in winter, and without candles the monastery would have been plunged into impenetrable gloom. But candles were costly. Tallow, made from rendered animal fat, was cheap but smoky, leaving behind a greasy film and an acrid odour. Beeswax was prized for its clean burn and bright light, but it was expensive, reserved for the church and for moments of devotion. In the cloister at night, a mixture of both might be used. Tallow for practical illumination, beeswax for sacred tasks. Every drip of wax mattered, and monks were trained to make candles last, to trim wicks carefully, to salvage the remnants for remoulding. The image of a candle slowly burning down, its melted wax hardening on cold stone floors, was not just a practical detail, it became a symbol of time itself. In the silence of the cloister, where speech was rare and movement deliberate, monks measured hours not by clocks but by wax. The length of a vigil, the timing of prayers, the waiting until matins, these could all be marked by the slow, steady dripping of a candle. To watch the wax pool and harden was to watch time slip away, a reminder of mortality, of the fleeting nature of life. Each candle consumed itself as it gave light, and in this the monk saw his own life mirrored, a body slowly burning down in service to God. Midnight watches in the cloister were acts of vigilance. A few monks assigned to keep watch walked the covered passageways while others slept. They carried small lanterns, their flames wavering in the draughty air. Their duty was partly practical, ensuring no fires broke out, no intruders entered, no sickness overtook a brother in the dormitory, but it was also deeply spiritual. The rule of St. Benedict called monks to be watchful, to guard their souls as they guarded the cloister. The act of pacing the cloister at night, of hearing one's own footsteps echo against stone, of feeling the chill air in silence, was a form of prayer. It was a living metaphor of vigilance, of staying awake for Christ, of being ready when the bridegroom came at midnight. Candle drippings became part of this ritual. On cold nights, wax hardened quickly on stone, leaving trails that marked where lanterns had passed. On warmer nights, the wax smeared and spread, sticky underfoot until it cooled. These traces lingered in the morning, reminders of the silent watchers who had walked before dawn. To an outsider, they might look like meaningless mess, but to the monks, they were evidence of obedience, the quiet testimony of a duty fulfilled. The cloister was not only a place of learning and prayer in daylight, it was a place of endurance and watchfulness at night. The economy of candles also shaped these watches. Monasteries produced their own candles, raising bees for wax, collecting tallow from livestock, and training lay brothers in the craft of candle making. But scarcity always loomed. Too many candles wasted meant fewer for winter, fewer for feast days, fewer for the great Easter vigil when light symbolized resurrection. Thus, the midnight watchers were careful. They shielded flames with horn lanterns, rationed light, and used it sparingly. Every drip was observed, every flame tended. Candle economy was not just practical, It was moral. To waste light was to waste God's creation. And yet, for all its austerity, the midnight watch carried quiet beauty. Imagine the cloister at night, arches casting shadows, the open courtyard filled with stars, the faint rustle of robes as monks walk their circuit. The lantern light flickered against carved stone, throwing halos around columns and tracing faint glows along the floor. The silence was not oppressive, it was contemplative. Each step became prayer, each breath an offering. The watchers did not seek comfort, they sought presence. In the candlelight in the dark, they believed they came nearer to the divine. The drippings themselves, gathered and remoulded, symbolised renewal. Wax was never wasted. Scraps were collected, melted and recast into new candles. What burned down could be remade. This too became metaphor. The body spent in service could be renewed by grace. The soul worn down by fatigue could be restored by prayer. This cycle of burning and remoulding echoed the cycle of death and resurrection, of labour and rest. Even in the most ordinary detail, the recycling of wax, the monks saw spiritual truth. But consider also the weariness of these vigils. To pace stone corridors in the middle of the night, half asleep, shivering in the cold, was no small burden. Some monks nodded off, their lanterns flickering dangerously. Others leaned against columns to steady themselves, fighting fatigue as best they could. The rule demanded vigilance, but the body often rebelled. Candle drippings on the floor might be symbols of devotion, but they were also marks of human frailty, signs that a monk had stumbled, spilled wax, lost focus. The cloister at night was not only a place of prayer, it was a place of struggle, where endurance was tested against weariness. And so we find ourselves returning to the tension that runs through all monastic life, between the sacred and the ordinary, between devotion and fatigue, between symbolism and practicality. Candle drippings in the cloister may seem like a minor detail, a footnote in the story of medieval monasticism, but they remind us that history is made of such details. The wax that fell to stone at midnight, unnoticed by most, carried within it the story of a community's discipline, economy, and faith. But here is the question to carry forward. When the last flame flickered out and only hardened wax remained on cold stone, did the monks truly feel that their watch had brought them nearer to God? Or did some, weary in body and spirit, wonder if the dripping candles were all that remained of their midnight devotion? In the last section, you stood with the silent watchers of the cloister, their lanterns flickering against stone, their candle drippings hardening on the floor as signs of endurance. Now let us step more deeply into the world of monastic candles, their making, their meaning, and the way these small sticks of wax became essential not only for light, but for the very rhythm of monastic life. For a monastery was not simply a place of prayer, it was also a place of production, where beeswax, tallow and flame shaped both devotion and economy. Candles began with resources, and in the medieval world they were not abundant. Beeswax, the most valued form of candle, required the keeping of hives. Many monasteries cultivated apiaries, rows of hives set carefully in gardens or near orchards where bees could gather nectar. Bees themselves became a symbol of order and industriousness. Their hive compared to the monastery, each bee a humble servant of a greater good. To collect honey was useful, but to harvest wax was precious. Every ounce of beeswax was carefully rendered, strained and shaped into candles reserved for the altar, the choir, and moments of sacred significance. To burn beeswax was to offer the purest light, bright, steady, sweet-smelling, and dignified. Tallow, by contrast, was common but less refined. Rendered from animal fat, usually sheep or cattle, it produced smoky, malodorous candles that sputtered and dripped. Yet monasteries relied on tallow for everyday tasks, lighting dormitories, illuminating kitchens, and fueling lanterns for the midnight watches. Brothers trained in candle making mixed both materials, stretching supplies as far as possible. In the dim cloister, the flicker of tallow candles was humble and practical, while the steady blaze of beeswax in the church lifted minds to the divine. In this contrast of lights lay a quiet lesson. Not every flame could be pure, yet every flame had its place. Candle making itself became a kind of spiritual labour. Lay brothers or novices were often tasked with the messy work, rendering fat, straining wax, dipping wicks again and again until the candle took shape. Each dip was a slow process. The wick passed into melted wax, then cooled, then dipped again. Layer upon layer formed, until the candle grew thick enough to burn for hours. It was monotonous work, but like so much in monastic life, monotony was a virtue. Repetition was prayer, patience was discipline, and even in candle making, the rule's call to humility was fulfilled. A finished candle carried within it not just wax, but hours of steady, repetitive devotion. The symbolism of candles ran deep. To burn was to be consumed for God. The candle gave light by losing itself, just as the monk gave his life in service. Hymns described Christ as the true light, and the candle became his image, a small flame reflecting the greater blaze of eternity. The Easter Vigil, when a single Paschal candle was lit and carried into the darkened church, embodied this belief. From one flame, many were kindled, the darkness pierced by light. Each monk who had tended candles in silence, who had melted scraps and remoulded them, saw his work revealed in that sacred moment. Light against darkness, order against chaos, life against death. But candles were not only symbolic, they were practical tools that governed time. Before mechanical clocks became common, monks measured hours by the burning length of candles. Special, calendrical candles were marked with notches or weights, designed to drip or burn steadily enough to track the passage of time. When the wax melted to a certain point, it signalled the hour for prayer. In this way, flame was clock, wax was calendar, and the monastery lived by its light. A midnight watcher could glance at the candle and know how far the night had passed. The drippings on the floor were not mere waste, they were time itself, melted and hardened in plain sight. The cloister at night, then, was both sacred and functional. Brothers walked their rounds with lanterns, ensuring that dormitories were safe, that no fire broke out, that the silence of sleep remained undisturbed. They noted the progress of candles, trimmed wicks, and gathered scraps. If a candle sputtered out too soon, they relit it. If wax pooled, they scraped it for reuse. Each task was small, but together they kept the monastery in order. Without such watchers, the monastery would stumble into chaos. Fire was a constant danger, thieves a lingering threat, illness a shadow over the dormitory. The midnight watch, with its candles and its silence, preserved the rhythm that allowed the monastery to endure. And yet, for all this discipline, the midnight watch was also deeply human. Monks grew weary, leaning against stone as their lanterns flickered. Some whispered prayers to keep themselves awake. Others recited psalms silently, their lips moving in the dark. Some no doubt resented the cold, the fatigue, the endless drip of wax. Candlelight revealed not only devotion but weakness, the droop of a head, the stumble of tired feet. To watch at midnight was to wrestle with the body, to push against its longing for rest. The candle consumed itself steadily, but the monk consumed himself unevenly, wavering, faltering, yet rising again to continue. This tension between weakness and devotion gave the watch its meaning. To endure the midnight hours was not expected to be easy. It was expected to be hard because difficulty revealed faith. A monk who stumbled in fatigue was still obedient if he remained at his post. A candle that sputtered still gave light until it died. Together they formed a portrait of perseverance. Imperfect, fragile, yet steadfast. Candle drippings on the cloister floor in the morning were more than hardened wax. They were the traces of men who endured, who offered their wakefulness in silence. The economic side of candles also shaped the monastery's outward role. Monks sold surplus beeswax to towns, supplied candles for churches, and sometimes even received donations of wax from nobles seeking favour. Candles became part of a spiritual economy. Light for masses, light for prayers, light for burials. A noble might sponsor candles to burn in perpetuity for his soul, and monks kept such lights alive. Counting wax, like counting sheep, became a form of stewardship, binding the monastery to the wider world through what seemed a simple commodity. Behind every glowing altar was the labour of bees, the work of brothers, the drippings of many nights. Yet, one cannot help but wonder, did the monks who walked the cloister at night always feel the presence of the divine? Or did the monotony of trimming wicks and scraping wax weigh heavier than the symbolism? Did the candle's flame lift every heart, Or did some stare at it in weariness, longing only for the bell that signalled the end of their watch? We have walked the cloister at midnight, watched the wax drip onto stone floors, and traced the weary footsteps of monks who kept their vigil in silence. Now, in this final section, we step back and ask, what did all of this mean? For the monks, for their communities, and for the history that followed. At first glance, candle drippings in a cloister seem a detail too small to matter, but history often hides its endurance in such details. The flame that flickered at midnight helped shape not only monastic devotion, but the very rhythms of medieval life. Candlelight shaped the monk's sense of time. Before mechanical clocks spread widely in the 13th and 14th centuries, monasteries relied on bells and candles to measure the night. A marked candle, burning steadily, became a silent timekeeper. When the wax reached a certain notch, it was time to wake the community for prayer. When it guttered out, the vigil ended. In this way, candles made abstract time tangible, visible, and inevitable. To watch wax drip and harden was to watch the night dissolve, each drop marking a moment that could never be reclaimed. The monk walking the cloister with his lantern was not only guarding silence, he was witnessing the passing of life itself. The symbolism was powerful. The candle that consumed itself to give light mirrored the monk who consumed his body in service. Each drip of wax was a drop of life, spent for others, burned away in obedience. Hymns and sermons returned to this imagery again and again, reminding the brothers that their purpose was not to preserve themselves, but to be expended. A candle that refused to burn was useless. A monk who refused to serve was unfaithful. In the cloister, where wax hardened on stone, the lesson was visible, undeniable, and daily. But symbolism did not erase hardship. Midnight vigils demanded endurance. The cold bit into skin, the damp of stone seeped into bones, and the constant battle against sleep wore down the body. Candle drippings testified not only to devotion but to struggle. They marked the faltering steps of weary brothers, the spills of wax from trembling hands, the accidents of fatigue. And in this humanity lay another lesson. Holiness was not perfection, but perseverance. To nod off and rise again, to spill wax and continue watching, was itself an act of faith. The hardened wax in the morning was not failure, it was witness. These watchers also tied the monastery to the wider world. Candles were commodities as much as symbols. Monks who guarded their light at night also sold wax by day, ensuring supplies for towns and churches. Nobles donated wax for the burning of perpetual lights, binding their memory to monastic prayer. In this way, candle drippings in a cloister were connected to burials in parish churches, to festivals in villages, to rituals that marked the cycle of seasons. The monastery's light spilled outward, its wax consumed for the sake of communities who saw in it protection, remembrance, and blessing. The midnight flame in the cloister became the flame at a peasant's funeral, the flame at a noble's wedding, the flame before an altar in a distant chapel. Even beyond religion, candles shaped culture. Their role as timekeepers influenced early experiments in measuring hours, paving the way for mechanical clocks that would transform Europe. Their symbolism of self-consuming service endured in poetry, sermons, and art, shaping how generations understood devotion. Their simple glow became shorthand for memory, for mourning, for hope. And at the heart of this legacy were the monks, walking the cloister at midnight, trimming wicks, scraping hardened wax, enduring fatigue. Their boring task became a foundation stone of tradition. But there was also an unspoken question in every vigil. Did the light always feel divine? Or did it sometimes feel empty, routine, even oppressive? Chroniclers hint at both possibilities. Some monks spoke of candlelight as a comfort in the dark, a visible sign of God's presence. Others grumbled about shortages of wax, about the weariness of night watches, about the futility of pacing stone floors while longing for sleep. The cloister's midnight was both holy and human, both radiant and weary. Candle drippings hardened not only as symbols of faith, but as reminders of the weight of discipline. And yet, the legacy endured. Even today, the image of a candle burning in silence carries weight. We light candles for the dead, for prayer, for memory, for comfort. We see in them what the monks saw: fragility, endurance, light against darkness. We may not walk cloisters at midnight, but we still find meaning in the flame that flickers, in the wax that drips, in the silence it creates. The boring detail of candle drippings in a medieval cloister still echoes in our rituals, our imaginations, our sense of time and devotion. So picture it one last time. The cloister arches stretch into shadow, the courtyard lies under stars, and a lone monk walks slowly, his lantern swaying, his eyes heavy. Wax drips onto stone, hardening into pale streaks that will be swept away at dawn. He prays in silence, perhaps drifting, perhaps doubting, but still enduring. His small flame, his small steps, his small drippings of wax carry within them the weight of centuries. What he does seems dull, routine, almost meaningless, and yet it becomes history, memory, tradition. The question remains for us. When you see a candle burn, do you see only light? Or do you see the centuries of silent watchers whose lives were consumed drip by drip in the same flame? By flickering candlelight, monks bent over parchment, copying psalters line by line, an endless devotion where ink, prayer, and patience became one. If the dormitory was the place of silence, and the cloister the place of watching, then the scriptorium, the writing room, was the place of endless labour. And at the heart of this labour stood one task above all, the copying of psalters. These books, collections of the 150 psalms, were the backbone of monastic prayer, sung daily, recited endlessly, forming the rhythm of devotion. Every monk needed them, every church required them, and because the printing press lay centuries in the future, every psalter had to be copied by hand. It was a task that never ended, that consumed countless hours of monastic life, that filled shelves with volumes and strained eyes with candlelight. To copy a psalter was to give one's body to repetition, to the slow, steady march of letters across parchment. Picture a monk in the scriptorium bent over a wooden desk, his quill sharpened, his inkwell steady at his side. The room is cold, for fires are rarely allowed near parchment, lest smoke and ash damage the work. Light filters through narrow windows, inadequate on cloudy days, forcing the monk to strain at the page. His hand moves slowly, carefully, each stroke deliberate. The psalms are familiar to him. He has chanted them daily, whispered them in silence, sung them in choir. Yet here he copies them again, word by word, line by line, hour after hour. The monotony is crushing, but monotony is the point. The act of copying is itself a form of prayer, each letter a devotion, each page a sacrifice of time. The materials themselves demanded attention. Parchment, made from animal skins, was expensive and time-consuming to prepare. Calf skin, known as vellum, provided the smoothest surface, but sheep and goat skins were also common. Before ink could ever touch the page, the skins had to be soaked, stretched, scraped, and dried. Laborious tasks often assigned to lay brothers. Once prepared, sheets were cut, ruled with faint lines and stacked into quires. The scribe's quill, usually cut from a goose feather, had to be trimmed regularly with a small knife. Ink was mixed from oak galls, iron salts, and gum, producing a dark, lasting script. Nothing about the process was quick. Every page carried the weight of hours, every book the labour of months, sometimes years, and the psalter was copied not once but countless times. Because the psalms formed the backbone of monastic prayer, every monk needed access to them, every chapel required a copy, every novice needed a book for training. Monasteries became factories of psalters, their scriptoria humming quietly with the scratch of quills. Some psalters were plain, meant for daily use, their script neat but unadorned. Others were elaborate, illuminated with gold leaf and coloured inks, adorned with decorated initials and marginal illustrations. These illuminated psalters were treasures, prized by kings and nobles, donated to monasteries, displayed in cathedrals. But whether plain or lavish, each psalter began the same way, with a monk hunched over parchment, writing word by word, line by line, until his back ached and his eyes burned. The labour tested the body. Chroniclers tell us of monks who complained of aching shoulders, stiff necks, trembling hands, and blurred vision. Some left small notes in the margins of their work. "The hand is weary," one scribe wrote. Another confessed, "Pray for me, for this labour is long." These notes, hidden between lines of sacred text, remind us that behind the pages were men, struggling with boredom, fatigue, and the monotony of endless copying, and yet they continued. The Psalms demanded it, the rule demanded it. The rhythm of monastic life left no room for complaint. To endure the monotony was to participate in devotion. Copying a psalter also required perfection. Errors were not easily forgiven. A misplaced letter could alter meaning, a skipped line could ruin a page. Corrections were made carefully, scraped away with a knife, ink reapplied. Some mistakes slipped through. Scribes occasionally confused words, repeated lines, or made small slips of spelling, but the overall standard was extraordinary. To copy a psalter was to participate in the preservation of scripture, to ensure that the words of the Psalms endured for generations. Every monk knew the weight of this responsibility. His tired eyes, his cramped hand, his stiff shoulders, all were given to the service of eternity. And yet, for all its spiritual importance, the task was boring. The Psalms never changed. The words repeated, familiar to the point of exhaustion. Monks who had chanted them daily now wrote them word by word, already knowing the next line, already able to recite the verse before it was copied. The monotony was total, and still they continued. For in monotony lay discipline, and in discipline lay holiness. The endless task of copying psalters by hand became a living parable. Faithfulness is not in novelty but in repetition, in showing up again and again, in enduring the dullness of duty. But imagine the silence of that room, the scratch of quills, the faint rustle of parchment, the occasional cough, the shifting of robes. Dozens of men bent over desks, hour after hour, producing line after line of script. Outside, the world moved with seasons, with battles, with kings and markets. Inside the scriptorium, time seemed frozen, locked into the rhythm of letters and lines. The psalter, copied endlessly, became a mirror of the monastery itself, repetitive, disciplined, quiet, enduring. It was boring, but it was also profound. And so, as you picture the monk tracing letters under dim light, ask yourself, did he find peace in the repetition, or despair in the monotony? Did the psalter become for him a source of devotion, or a burden too heavy to carry? Did the endless task of copying words he already knew by heart lift him toward God, or sink him deeper into fatigue? The monk hunched over his parchment in the scriptorium may have felt his labour to be repetitive, but from that repetition came works of astonishing beauty. In this section, we turn to the artistry of psalters, their illumination, their decoration, and their influence on medieval culture. For while the copying of psalms was often monotonous, it also produced some of the most enduring treasures of the medieval world. Not all psalters were alike. Many were plain, written in tidy but unadorned script, meant for daily use in choir or for the private devotion of novices. These were functional, the tools of monastic life, worn and handled daily. But some psalters were transformed into works of art, illuminated with gold leaf, painted with vibrant pigments, and adorned with intricate designs. Such books were costly and time-consuming to produce, often taking years of labour. They became symbols of devotion and status, sought after by kings, nobles, and wealthy patrons. Some were donated to monasteries as acts of piety, others commissioned as gifts, still. Others used as ceremonial objects in great cathedrals. Through the psalter, the boring work of copying words became the canvas for some of the Middle Ages' most dazzling artistry. Illumination was itself a discipline. After the scribe copied the text, leaving spaces for decorated initials, the illuminator stepped in. Using brushes made from squirrel or hog hair and pigments derived from minerals, plants, or insects, the illuminator brought the psalter to life. Gold leaf was applied with painstaking care, catching candlelight in ways that seemed almost otherworldly. Ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, was more precious than gold itself, yet it found its way into the robes of painted saints and the skies of illuminated pages. Even the smallest psalter might contain elaborate initials, twisting vines, tiny animals peeking from letters, or grotesque faces hidden in margins. What began as monotony for the scribe became creativity for the artist. The psalter's structure lent itself to decoration. Divided into 150 psalms, it offered natural breaks for initials, headings, and marginalia. Psalm 1, Psalm 51, and Psalm 101 were often highlighted with especially elaborate decoration, marking the divisions of the book into 3 parts. Monks and artists filled margins with flowers, vines, and creatures both real and imaginary. Some psalters bore tiny scenes of daily life, glimpses of peasants working fields or monks at prayer, reminders that the Psalms, though ancient, still lived in the world of the present. These details gave colour and variety to a book that otherwise repeated the same familiar text. Illuminated psalters also carried deep symbolism. The gold shimmered as the light of God, the blue of lapis represented heaven, the green of malachite symbolised new life. Every detail was chosen with care, every flourish carried meaning. To hold such a psalter was to hold not just scripture, but a vision of the divine. And yet behind this beauty lay the same endless copying, the same monotony of strokes across parchment. The artistry did not erase the labour, it crowned it. Training to copy psalters was itself a discipline. Novices in monasteries often began their education by learning letters, practicing strokes on wax tablets before moving to parchment. They memorised the psalms by chanting them, then reinforced that memory by copying them. The psalter became not only a text but a teacher, instilling language, rhythm, and devotion. Young scribes learned patience by tracing lines they already knew, humility by enduring correction, and steadiness by resisting the urge to rush. Copying the psalter was as much about shaping the monk as it was about shaping the book. Beyond the monastery, psalters shaped culture in profound ways. They became the most common book of the Middle Ages, more widespread even than complete Bibles. Their portability, their centrality to devotion, and their familiarity made them treasured objects in both cloister and court. Nobles carried psalters for private prayer, queens donated them to churches, peasants glimpsed them in parish processions. Some psalters became heirlooms, passed down through generations. Others were lost, their parchment reused for bindings or covers, their beauty destroyed by neglect. But in their time, psalters formed the backbone of medieval literacy, devotion, and artistry. And yet, behind every illuminated page, every shimmering initial, lay hours of monotony. For every gold leaf applied, hundreds of words had been copied in plain ink. For every painted saint, thousands of letters had been formed with aching hands. The psalter was born of boredom and beauty alike. Its endurance reminds us that history often arises not from excitement but from perseverance, not from novelty but from repetition. But here is the question that lingers. Did the monks who bent over their quills ever pause to admire the beauty of the illuminated pages? Or were they too consumed by fatigue, too buried in repetition, to see the glory their labour produced? The scriptorium was a place of repetition, of aching hands and tired eyes, yet from it came the Psalter, perhaps the most influential book of the Middle Ages. In this final section, we reflect on what this endless task meant for the monks themselves, for the preservation of scripture, and for the history that followed. Copying psalters by hand was more than clerical labour. It was an act of cultural preservation. The Psalms, recited daily in the divine office, needed to be present in every monastery, chapel, and church. Without copying, the words risked fading into silence. Each scribe, though weary, carried the burden of continuity. He knew that his cramped lines on parchment would outlast him, that future monks would chant from the very words he had traced. In this way, the monotonous act of copying psalters became the bridge between generations, ensuring that the rhythm of prayer never broke. The psalter also shaped literacy. For many novices, learning to read meant learning to read the Psalms. The repetition of verses, familiar from choir, ingrained through copying, made them the perfect primer. To read the Psalter was to enter the rhythm of Scripture, to let words become second nature. Over time, this practice spread literacy beyond the cloister. Psalters entered households of the wealthy, carried by nobles and queens who sought private devotion. In some cases, these books were the only texts lay people ever owned. Thus, the monks' endless labour in the scriptorium slowly shaped the literacy of Europe, turning repetitive copying into cultural transformation. The Psalter also became the foundation for art. The illuminated manuscripts we admire in museums today, the golden initials, the blue of lapis, the intricate vines and creatures in margins, all sprang from psalters. These books carried not just text but vision, blending devotion with beauty. To open an illuminated psalter was to see heaven reflected in ink and gold. But behind every shimmering page lay hours of unseen labour, thousands of strokes of plain letters, endless lines copied by weary monks. The beauty we remember today was built on the monotony we often forget. This tension between monotony and magnificence defined the Psalter. To the monk, it was a burden, a duty, a test of patience. To history, it became a treasure, a symbol of devotion and artistry. The scribe who muttered, "My hand is weary," could not have known that centuries later his work would be displayed behind glass, admired as priceless. What he saw as endless repetition, we see as cultural survival. What he endured in silence, we celebrate in memory. Yet the human side remains. Notes in margins reveal monks who struggled, who complained, who asked for prayers. One wrote, "Now I have finished, thanks be to God, for the work was long and my hand is tired." Another scribbled, "Whoever reads this, remember me." These voices remind us that behind every page was a man, not a machine, enduring boredom, finding meaning where he could, leaving traces of himself in ink. The Psalter was sacred, but the labour was human. With the coming of the printing press in the 15th century, the endless task ended. No longer did scribes need to copy psalms by hand. Presses could produce hundreds of copies in weeks. The silence of the scriptorium gave way to the hum of machinery. For many monks, this must have felt like a liberation. No more aching backs, no more endless lines, no more eyes straining by candlelight. But something was also lost. The personal touch, the devotion woven into every line, the patience carved into every letter, all faded. The press preserved the words, but the labour, the monotony, the prayer behind the copying disappeared. And so, the Psalter stands as both memory and legacy. It reminds us that much of history is built not on drama, but on dullness, not on grand acts, but on steady, repetitive work. The monks who copied line after line, day after day, did not see themselves as making history. They saw themselves as serving God. Yet in their service, they preserved culture, shaped literacy, and created beauty. Their boredom became our inheritance. So picture the scriptorium one last time. The cold air, the scratch of quills, the hunched backs of weary men. A monk lifts his head, rubs his aching hand, sighs, and bends again to his work. His lines blur, his letters wobble, but he continues, page after page, line after line, stroke after stroke. His task is endless, his body weary, his patience thin, and yet, centuries later, his labour remains, bound in leather, preserved in libraries, admired by strangers he could never imagine. And here is the final question. When we admire the beauty of illuminated psalters, do we remember the boredom, the fatigue, the monotony that created them? Or do we let the gold and colours hide the endless strokes of tired hands, forgetting that history is often built on tasks so dull they seemed almost unbearable at the time? Within monastery walls, silence ruled with iron weight, every spoken word a trespass, every hush a prayer, voices buried, yet discipline breathed eternal. To enter a medieval monastery was to enter a world governed by rules, and few rules shaped monastic life more deeply than the rule of silence. For monks who lived under the rule of St. Benedict and its many adaptations, speech was not a freedom to be used at will. It was a danger to be restrained, a temptation that could lead to sin. Silence was not merely the absence of words, it was a discipline, a spiritual practice, and at times a burden. To break silence was not just bad manners, it could be counted as disobedience, sometimes even as sin. Imagine the cloister in daylight. The arches cast long shadows across the stone walkway. The garden sits quietly at its centre, and monks move along the covered paths, their sandals brushing softly against stone. No chatter fills the air. No idle conversation breaks the rhythm. If a monk passes his brother, he nods but does not speak. Words are rationed, permitted only at certain times, in certain places, for certain purposes. To talk freely, to laugh, to gossip, these were forbidden. The monastery was a house of silence. Why such severity? The answer lies in the heart of monastic spirituality. Speech was considered powerful, but also dangerous. A careless word could spark anger, spread gossip, encourage pride. A burst of laughter could break the solemnity of devotion. Words could distract, disturb, or destroy the discipline of the community. St. Benedict, writing in the 6th century, instructed his monks to cultivate silence at all times and to avoid grievous sins of speech. He saw silence as the soil in which prayer could grow, as the space where the soul could hear God's whisper. To speak carelessly was to drown out the divine voice with human noise. The rule of silence was enforced with precision. Monks were permitted to speak in chapter meetings where decisions were made, or in confession, where sins were admitted. They spoke during liturgy, chanting psalms in unison. But outside these settings, speech was tightly controlled. In the refectory where meals were taken, silence reigned. A reader recited scripture while the community ate in quiet. No one commented on the food, no one discussed the day. Even practical communication was limited. Instead of words, monasteries developed systems of signs, hand gestures that conveyed basic needs. A motion of the hand might ask for bread, a wave might request water, a finger traced in the air might signify a book. In this way, daily life could continue without speech, preserving silence without sacrificing function. But silence was not easy. For men who had once lived ordinary lives, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, the sudden demand to abandon casual speech could be crushing. In the first months of novitiate, many struggled. Chroniclers tell us of novices punished for whispering in dormitories, for murmuring during work, for laughing in cloisters. Some were assigned penances, prayers, fasting, or even lying prostrate before the community. The discipline was not meant to be cruel, but to shape the monk into obedience, to train him to guard his tongue as carefully as his soul. The silence carried into the dormitory. At night, whispers were forbidden. If a monk stirred, if he was restless or sick, he bore it quietly. If he needed help, he used gestures, not words. Silence made the dormitory heavier, more oppressive, but it also bound the community together in discipline. Every brother endured the same restraint, and in that restraint they found unity. The rule of silence was not only about personal discipline, it was about preserving harmony in the monastery, and yet silence had its paradoxes. Monks chanted psalms daily, their voices filling churches with sound. They copied texts, writing words endlessly onto parchment. They delivered sermons to guests, offered counsel to nobles, and taught in schools. Speech was not absent from their lives, but it was restricted, ordered, made purposeful. Silence was the default, speech the exception. In this way, the monastery inverted the outside world. Where villagers and nobles filled their days with chatter, argument, and noise, the monastery pursued the opposite, a life where silence ruled and words were rationed like precious goods. The psychological effects of such silence were profound. Some monks found peace in it, a stillness that calmed the soul and opened the mind to prayer. Others found it oppressive, a weight that silenced not only idle chatter, but also friendship, comfort, and laughter. To live in silence was to confront one's own thoughts without escape, to wrestle with the noise inside when no words could be spoken outside. Silence could heal, but it could also haunt. It shaped the monk not only outwardly, but inwardly, pressing him into a mould of discipline that few could endure easily. The rule of silence also carried social implications. Hierarchies of speech emerged. Abbots spoke freely, giving orders and counsel. Senior monks were permitted some words. Novices remained largely mute. Silence reinforced authority, reminding monks daily of their place in the order. To speak out of turn was not just a breach of discipline, but a challenge to hierarchy. In this way, silence preserved not only spirituality but structure, ensuring that the community remained orderly and obedient. And so, silence became more than a rule. It became a way of life. The monastery was not just a place of prayer, but a place where words themselves were distrusted. Every utterance was weighed, every phrase considered. Monks learned to live without chatter, to communicate with signs, to surrender the comfort of conversation. The silence shaped them, for better or worse, leaving traces in their posture, their demeanour, their habits of thought. But the question lingers, was silence truly holy, or was it sometimes a burden too heavy to bear? Did the monks find in their silence the voice of God, or did some lie awake in the dormitory, aching for the sound of a brother's whispered word? The silence of the monastery was not accidental. it was enforced. In this section, we explore how the rule of silence was lived in practice, the punishments for breaking it, the creation of monastic sign language, and the way silence shaped medieval spirituality and even influenced later traditions beyond the cloister walls. Enforcement began with the rule of St. Benedict itself. In chapter 6 of the Regula Benedicti, written in the 6th century, Benedict declared that since it is written, "In much talking thou shalt not avoid sin," we must guard our tongues. He prescribed silence at all times except where necessity demanded speech. Monasteries across Europe adopted and adapted this principle. Silence became a rule not merely of custom but of law. To speak without permission, to laugh, to gossip, these were not trivial slips but failures of obedience. The abbey was a school of discipline, and silence was one of its first lessons. Breaking silence carried penalties. A monk who spoke out of turn might be required to confess his fault before the community, bowing low or lying prostrate on the floor. He might be assigned additional prayers, fasting, or the denial of privileges. In stricter houses, repeated violations could result in exclusion from communal meals or from the choir. These punishments reinforced the seriousness of silence. Words were not free, and every utterance had weight. A single careless joke could lead to penance. A whispered complaint could bring shame. In such an atmosphere, monks learned to measure every word or to remain wordless altogether. Yet silence did not mean total muteness. Life required communication, and so monasteries developed systems of signs. These monastic sign languages, though varying from house to house, allowed brothers to signal their needs without breaking the rule. A monk could gesture for bread at the refectory, indicate thirst with a motion of the hand to his mouth, or signal a book by tracing the shape of a rectangle in the air. In Cistercian monasteries, detailed sign lists were created, covering not only food and tools but even abstract concepts like enough or quickly. These signs allowed the monastery to function smoothly without speech, replacing noise with a silent choreography of gestures. Even today, some of these sign lists survive, testifying to the ingenuity of monks who found ways to speak without speaking. The rule of silence also shaped daily routines. At meals, the silence was filled by the voice of a designated reader, who stood at a lectern and recited scripture or hagiographies while the community ate. The words of the reader replaced conversation, ensuring that even eating became prayer. In the cloister, silence was broken only by chanting during the divine office. At work, monks laboured in quiet, their tasks accompanied not by chatter but by thought and prayer. The silence of the monastery was not empty. It was structured, filled with scripture, song and contemplation. It replaced the noise of daily life with a rhythm of devotion. The psychological effects of such silence were complex. For many monks, the absence of casual conversation allowed the mind to focus. Freed from the distractions of gossip, they turned inward, meditating on scripture, repeating prayers, or simply enduring the discipline of stillness. Silence became a crucible in which the soul was tested. Yet for others, silence carried loneliness. Without the comfort of words, friendships struggled to grow. Without laughter, the cloister could feel heavy, even oppressive. The very rule that bound the community together also kept its members apart. The tension between unity and isolation, between holiness and burden, ran through every silent corridor. Despite these challenges, silence came to be seen as a mark of sanctity. Writers praised monks for their restraint, describing them as angels on earth, dwelling in stillness, attuned to God's voice. Pilgrims visiting monasteries were struck by the quiet, contrasting it with the noise of markets, taverns and villages. Silence became part of the monastery's identity, one of the traits that set it apart from the world. For outsiders, the silence of monks was both mysterious and awe-inspiring, a sign that these men lived differently, more purely, closer to heaven. The influence of monastic silence extended beyond the cloister. In later centuries, mendicant orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans did not impose such strict silence, but they inherited its spirit. Words must be purposeful, not wasted. Even in secular culture, the ideal of measured speech lingered, echoed in proverbs that warned against idle talk. The discipline of silence, born in monasteries, seeped into wider thought about morality and speech. To speak less became a mark of wisdom, restraint and dignity. The monastery, by its silence, taught Europe to respect the weight of words. Yet, for the monks themselves, silence was never entirely simple. To obey the rule was to embrace restraint, but restraint was often difficult. Some monks admitted in letters or chronicles that they longed for conversation, that they missed the sound of laughter, that silence could feel like a cage. Others confessed that silence sharpened their inner noise, that when their tongues were restrained their minds grew louder, filling the emptiness with temptation or distraction. Silence, in this way, was not an escape but a confrontation. It forced monks to face themselves without the shield of chatter, to wrestle with thoughts unspoken. For some, this brought peace. For others, it brought struggle. And so the rule of silence was both a gift and a burden. It gave the monastery its unique identity, its atmosphere of stillness and devotion. It protected the community from gossip and pride, preserved harmony, and opened space for prayer. But it also weighed heavily on human hearts, silencing comfort as well as conflict, laughter as well as anger. In silence the monks sought God, but in silence they also faced their own fragility. Here lies the paradox. Silence was meant to be holy, yet it could also feel harsh. It was meant to draw monks together, yet it sometimes pushed them apart. It was meant to quiet the soul, yet it sometimes stirred the mind into restlessness. The cloister's silence was not peace, it was discipline, and discipline, though valuable, was rarely easy. And so we must ask, when a monk raised his hand in a silent gesture for bread, when he bowed in penance for a whispered word, when he endured meals without conversation, did he believe the silence lifted him closer to God? Or did he sometimes wonder if the rule had mistaken restraint for holiness? We have walked the cloister in silence, watched monks communicate with gestures, and seen words rationed as if they were dangerous luxuries. Now, in this final section, we consider the legacy of the rule of silence, how it shaped monastic identity, how it influenced Western spirituality and culture, and how its echoes still linger in the way we think about silence today. For the medieval monk, silence was never merely the absence of sound. It was presence, of discipline, of focus, of God. By stripping away conversation, silence forced the monk to confront himself, to listen more carefully to scripture, to resist the temptations of idle chatter. The monastery became a world apart, not because its walls were high, but because its soundscape was different. Villages rang with laughter, argument, and song. Markets were filled with bargaining and gossip. Courts resounded with debate. But in the monastery, silence reigned. Visitors entering cloisters often remarked on the stillness, describing it as otherworldly, almost unsettling. The silence itself became a form of witness, a sermon without words. This silence left its mark on the development of Western spirituality. Later traditions of contemplation, from the mystical writings of the 14th century cloud of unknowing to the meditative practices of modern monastic orders, owe their foundation to the rule of silence. The idea that God's voice is best heard in stillness, that the heart must be quiet to receive divine presence, has shaped centuries of Christian thought. Even beyond the cloister, preachers and spiritual writers praised silence as a virtue, urging restraint in speech and caution in words. Better to be silent and be thought wise, they echoed, than to speak and reveal folly. Silence also became a symbol of authority. In monasteries, abbots often broke silence to give commands, while ordinary monks endured wordlessness. This reinforced hierarchy, but also taught humility. Speech became power, silence became obedience. In broader culture, the association lingered. Those who spoke sparingly seemed wiser, more dignified, more trustworthy. Silence acquired prestige. To be silent was not weakness, but strength. In this way, the monastery helped to shape the cultural ideal of the silent sage, the person whose restraint proved greater than the chatter of the crowd. But the rule of silence also carried shadows. For some monks, silence meant isolation. Without words of comfort, loneliness deepened. Without laughter, community felt cold. The discipline that promised peace sometimes delivered heaviness. Records from monastic life occasionally revealed discontent. Brothers who found silence oppressive, novices who struggled to endure it, men who longed for the simple joy of a spoken word. Silence could feel like closeness to God, but it could also feel like exile from human warmth. the paradox remained unresolved, lingering like the hush of the cloister itself, both holy and heavy, both gift and burden. The influence of monastic silence extended far beyond the Middle Ages. The early modern period saw new forms of religious devotion, retreats, quiet prayer, private meditation, all shaped by the monastic heritage of silence. Even in secular culture, silence retained meaning. Think of the courtroom, where silence commands respect, the library, where silence creates space for thought, the funeral where silence marks grief. All these echoes trace back in part to the monastery's insistence that silence is not emptiness but significance. In modern times, silence has taken on new layers. We speak of moments of silence to honour the dead, to pause in tragedy, to remember what words cannot capture. We associate silence with respect, reflection, reverence. We even turn to silence for rest, in contrast to the constant noise of daily life. And yet, the challenge remains. Silence can be comforting, but it can also be uncomfortable. It can bring peace, but it can also expose loneliness. The paradox that monks wrestled with in the cloister still confronts us today. The rule of silence thus leaves us with questions as relevant now as in the Middle Ages. Is silence truly the path to wisdom, or does it risk cutting us off from one another? Is restraint in speech a form of holiness, or can it become a burden too heavy for human hearts? Can silence draw us closer to the divine, or does it sometimes amplify the noise within? These questions, unanswered, are part of the rule's legacy. So picture the cloister one last time. The arches stretch overhead, the garden lies still at the centre, and monks walk the covered walkway in silence. A brother raises his hand in a gesture for bread, another bows in penance for a whispered word, another endures the weight of unspoken thoughts. Their silence is heavy, yet it is also full. It shapes them, disciplines them, binds them. It is boring, perhaps, even oppressive, but it is also profound. And here is the thought to carry with you. When we encounter silence in our own lives, do we see it as absence or as presence? Do we avoid it as emptiness or embrace it as meaning? The monks of the Middle Ages lived their lives in silence, believing that in wordlessness they might hear God. What do we hear in our silence? At plain wooden tables, monks shared bread, ale, and porridge, simple meals that fed bodies quietly, while prayers and discipline nourished their souls. If silence governed the monastery's speech and prayer, food governed its survival. To live the monastic life was not only to pray and labour, but also to eat, and the meals of monks reveal much about their world. Plain, repetitive, carefully measured, and guided by rules as strict as those that ordered their silence. Bread, ale, and porridge formed the staples of this diet, eaten day after day, year after year. They were ordinary foods, even boring by modern standards, but in their ordinariness lay the rhythm of medieval monastic life. The rule of St. Benedict devoted surprising attention to food. Written in the 6th century, it prescribed moderation. Monks were not to eat meat from four-footed animals except in sickness, and they were to receive 2 meals a day in most seasons, one at midday and another in the evening. Wine, though discouraged, was permitted in moderation, for Benedict admitted that monks of our time cannot be convinced of this. The rule emphasised sufficiency without indulgence, nourishment without luxury. Food was a necessity, not a pleasure. In this spirit, the monastic diet centred on the simplest of fare. Bread was the foundation, made from coarse grains, rye, barley, oats, or, where available, wheat. Monastic bread was dense, dark, and filling. It was baked in large communal ovens, often by lay brothers who rose early to knead and tend the dough. Bread was measured in loaves or portions, rationed carefully to ensure fairness and to prevent gluttony. A monk received his bread at meals in the refectory, and sometimes a small allowance was provided for private use, such as breaking the fast at dawn. Bread was more than food. It was a symbol of unity, the same loaf divided among brothers, the same taste shared day after day. Yet its monotony could wear thin. Chronicles record complaints of stale or mouldy bread, of portions too small to satisfy hunger. But the rule did not promise comfort, it promised sufficiency. Alongside bread came ale, the common drink of monasteries. Water, though available, was often unsafe or unappealing, carrying the risk of contamination. Ale, brewed from barley or oats, offered a safer, more nutritious alternative. It was weak by modern standards, closer to what we might call small beer, but it provided calories, hydration and warmth. Monasteries brewed their own ale, maintaining breweries as part of their estates. Brewing was a daily task requiring fires, kettles and patience. The ale flowed not for celebration but for survival, consumed with meals, rationed in mugs or tankards. Stronger ale was brewed for feast days or for guests, but the monks themselves usually drank the weaker everyday kind. To the modern mind, drinking ale with every meal might seem indulgent. To the medieval monk, it was as ordinary as water. Porridge rounded out the staples. Made from oats, barley, or other grains boiled in water or milk, porridge was simple, filling, and endlessly repetitive. Sometimes flavoured with peas, beans or herbs, sometimes plain, it was a meal that required little preparation and stretched resources far. In poorer monasteries, porridge might be the main dish day after day, varied only by what ingredients were available. In wealthier houses, it supplemented bread and vegetables, forming the base of the monastic diet. Like bread and ale, porridge symbolised sufficiency, enough to fill the stomach, never enough to excite the senses. Vegetables played a supporting role. Monasteries maintained gardens, growing beans, peas, onions, leeks and cabbages. These appeared in stews or soups, added to porridge, or served alongside bread. Fish was permitted, especially on fast days when meat was forbidden, and monasteries near rivers or coasts relied heavily on it. Eggs and cheese were sometimes allowed, though often restricted depending on the interpretation of the rule. Meat from four-footed animals, beef, pork, lamb, was officially banned except in infirmaries for the sick. Yet in practice, many monasteries bent this rule, particularly in later centuries, allowing meat in separate dining halls or justifying it under various exceptions. Still, the ideal remained: a diet of bread, ale, porridge, vegetables, and fish, plain and predictable. The setting of meals reinforced their discipline. The refectory was the dining hall, often a long vaulted room with wooden tables arranged in rows. Monks ate in silence, listening as one brother read aloud from scripture or from the lives of saints. No conversation was permitted. The only sounds were the clatter of spoons, the scrape of benches, and the steady voice of the reader. Eating was not a social event, but a continuation of prayer. Food nourished the body as scripture nourished the soul. Silence at table reminded monks that eating was not about pleasure, but about sustenance, a duty performed with gratitude and restraint. Fasting added further discipline. Monks fasted frequently, abstaining from certain foods or reducing portions during Lent, Advent, and on numerous fast days throughout the year. These fasts made the simple diet even plainer, reinforcing the rhythm of deprivation and moderation. The body was trained to accept hunger, to endure discomfort, to rely on God rather than indulgence. The monotony of bread, ale, and porridge was itself a form of fasting, a daily reminder that the monk's life was not his own but given in obedience. For modern readers, such a diet may seem dull, even oppressive. Where is the variety, the pleasure, the joy of food? Yet for monks, monotony was the point. By stripping food of luxury, they stripped it of temptation. By eating the same staples daily, they freed themselves from craving novelty. Bread, ale, and porridge were not exciting, but they were enough. In their sufficiency, monks found a kind of freedom. Freedom from the endless search for satisfaction. Freedom from the tyranny of desire. And yet, the question lingers. Did the monks truly find peace in this simplicity? Or did they sometimes sit in the refectory longing for flavours they would never taste again? Did the monotony of bread, ale, and porridge bring contentment? Or did it conceal hunger, dissatisfaction, even resentment? To understand the daily meals of monks, we must go beyond the refectory table and into the fields, gardens, kitchens, and breweries that supplied it. For monasteries were not merely places of prayer, they were also engines of production. Every loaf of bread, every pot of porridge, every jug of ale began with labour, much of it done within the monastery itself. The food that filled bowls and mugs was the product of a tightly organised economy, woven into both spiritual and practical life. The monastic grangers' monasteries often held vast estates, divided into smaller farms called granges. These granges were staffed by lay brothers or hired peasants who tilled the fields, sowed crops and harvested grain. Wheat, barley, rye and oats were the staples, each destined for bread, ale, or porridge. The grain system allowed monasteries to feed themselves and produce surpluses for trade. A monk's slice of bread at supper was not only a symbol of unity, but the end result of coordinated labour that stretched from ploughing fields to milling grain to baking loaves. Every mouthful carried the weight of an entire system of labour, economy and discipline, the gardens of the cloister. Alongside grain came vegetables from monastic gardens. These gardens were not ornamental but practical, arranged in neat rows of beans, peas, onions, garlic and leeks. Cabbages were common, boiled into stews that thickened porridge. Herbs such as sage, parsley and dill added flavour, though sparingly. The garden was as much a classroom as a kitchen supply. Monks saw their labour there as an echo of Eden, an imitation of Adam's first task to till the soil. The garden represented simplicity, but it was also necessity. Without it, porridge would have been bland beyond endurance, bread dry and joyless. The modest additions of peas or leeks gave variety to meals otherwise dominated by grain. The monastic brewery ale was the lifeblood of the monastery, and brewing was a carefully maintained art. Large monasteries ran full breweries, producing vast quantities of ale for daily consumption. The process was simple but labour-intensive. Grains were malted, mashed, boiled and fermented in great wooden vats. The resulting ale was weak by modern standards, closer to a nourishing broth than a recreational drink, but it provided essential calories, filling gaps left by meagre meals. Brewing required constant attention, from stoking fires to cleaning vats to tapping casks. Each mug set on the refectory table carried with it hours of unseen labour, the monotony of routine transformed into sustenance. Fish and waterways. While meat from four-footed animals was forbidden, fish was not. Monasteries near rivers or coasts relied heavily on fish, and many inland monasteries constructed elaborate fish ponds to supply their needs. These ponds, carefully engineered with channels and sluices, allowed for controlled breeding and harvesting. Carp, pike and eels were common. On fast days, fish replaced meat, offering protein without breaking the rule. The maintenance of these ponds was a science of its own, requiring attention to water flow, cleanliness and breeding cycles. To scoop fish from a pond and place it on the table was to bring the work of hydrology and husbandry into the rhythm of prayer. Cheese, butter and dairy products also featured in monastic diets, though rules varied. Cheese was common, made from cows or sheep's milk, pressed into rounds and aged. Butter and milk were rarer, often restricted to the infirmary or to feast days. Still, they supplemented the monotony of bread and porridge, adding richness when permitted. Monks who tended herds of cattle or flocks of sheep provided not only wool and hides, but also milk for cheese making. Again, food was tied to labour, each bite connected to the daily rhythms of tending animals and processing milk. The kitchen and the refectory. Inside the monastery, kitchens turned raw ingredients into meals. Fires burned in great hearths, pots of porridge simmered, bread baked in ovens, vegetables boiled into stews. Lay brothers, kitchen servants, or designated monks worked tirelessly, often in hot, smoky conditions. The refectory, where meals were served, was the stage for this labour. Monks sat at long wooden tables, portions distributed carefully, meals eaten in silence while scripture was read aloud. The food itself was plain, but the ritual elevated it. Eating was not about taste, it was about discipline, equality, and gratitude. Surplus and trade-large monasteries produced more than they consumed. Surpluses of bread, ale, fish, or cheese were sold in local markets, making monasteries significant economic players. Monastic ale, in particular, gained reputations for quality, and some abbeys became renowned for brewing traditions that survive in Europe even today. In this way, the ordinary meals of monks reached beyond cloister walls, shaping local economies, feeding peasants, and financing the grandeur of monastic churches. What began as porridge in a pot or grain in a vat became wealth that built cathedrals, the spiritual meaning of food. Yet for all its practicality, food was never merely material, it was spiritual. Meals were eaten in silence, accompanied by the reading of scripture. Bread was shared as a symbol of unity, ale drunk as a reminder of moderation, Porridge endured as a discipline against desire. Food was never indulgence, it was a mirror of the monastic ideal, plain, sufficient, restrained. Even the kitchen labour became a form of devotion, for to feed brothers was to serve Christ himself. But the question lingers, did monks, while eating their daily porridge and bread, truly find the spiritual meaning intended for them? Or did some, weary of repetition, secretly long for meat, spice and flavour, the very luxuries their vows denied? The daily diet of monks, bread, ale, porridge, vegetables and fish, was plain, repetitive and carefully measured. But to understand its full significance, we must place it within the larger rhythms of fasting and feasting, of discipline and celebration, of survival and spirituality. Monastic meals were not only about sustenance, they reflected an entire worldview in which food became both a tool of restraint and a sign of abundance, both boring and profound. The cycle of fasting structured the monastic calendar. Lent, Advent and countless saints' days imposed restrictions on what could be eaten and when. On fast days, meat was forbidden, portions reduced and meals delayed until later hours. The result was a diet that became even plainer than usual. Porridge without additions, bread without butter, ale rationed sparingly. The discipline of fasting aimed not only to weaken the body but to strengthen the soul, reminding monks that they lived not for pleasure but for obedience. Hunger was itself a prayer, a bodily reminder of dependence on God. For monks accustomed already to simplicity, fasting sharpened the monotony to its most austere edge, the joy of feasting. Yet fasting was not the only rhythm. Feasts punctuated the year with moments of abundance. Easter, Christmas, and the feast days of important saints lifted restrictions. On such days, tables groaned with fish, eggs, cheese, sometimes even meat, depending on the house's rules and resources. Special breads were baked, stronger ale was brewed, spices and honey were added to porridge. The refectory that was usually austere rang with a different tone, the silence broken by hymns of celebration. Feasts were rare but memorable, reminders that joy had its place even in a life of restraint. For the monk who endured porridge day after day, the sweetness of honey or the richness of cheese on a feast day was a revelation. The contrast itself was the lesson. Joy meant more when it was rare. Meals as mirrors of discipline. Ordinary meals, though repetitive, reflected deeper truths about the monastic life. Bread was daily sustenance, just as prayer was daily rhythm. Ale was moderation, enough to live, but not enough to indulge. Porridge was monotony, the embrace of boredom as discipline. Together they mirrored the monk's vows, stability, obedience, and conversion of life. To eat daily bread, in silence, to drink weak ale without complaint, to endure plain porridge patiently, these were not small things, but daily enactments of devotion. Each meal became a miniature reflection of the monastic calling. Influence, beyond the cloister. The monastic diet did not remain within monastery walls. Surpluses of bread, ale, fish and cheese flowed into local markets, shaping the diets of peasants and townsfolk. Brewing traditions begun in monasteries became foundations of European beer culture. Agricultural innovations in monastic granges improved yields, influencing surrounding regions. Even the rhythms of fasting and feasting filtered into broader Christian practice, shaping the dietary habits of medieval society as a whole. What monks ate, or refused to eat, rippled outward into the wider culture, embedding discipline in daily life far beyond cloister walls, the human struggle. Yet, for all the symbolism, the human side cannot be ignored. Not every monk found holiness in porridge. Records and chronicles reveal complaints: bread too hard, portions too small, ale too weak. Some monks struggled with hunger, others with temptation. Stories circulate of monks sneaking meat, of abbots bending rules, of tensions between ideal and practice. The rule prescribed sufficiency, but human desire always pushed against it. The gap between devotion and appetite, between discipline and longing, was a daily battle. And perhaps this is the real lesson. Holiness was not achieved by eating porridge without desire, but by enduring desire without surrender. The legacy of ordinary meals. Today, when we think of monasteries, we often imagine their chants, their books, their architecture. But their meals deserve equal remembrance. Bread, ale, and porridge were not glamorous, but they sustained centuries of devotion, scholarship, and survival. They trained bodies in discipline, shaped communities in equality, and influenced the diets of entire regions. The boredom of meals became a form of devotion, a daily act of perseverance that sustained both monks and their culture. So picture the refectory one last time, the long tables, the flicker of candles, the silence filled by the voice of a reader. Monks bow their heads, receive their bread, lift their mugs of ale, and spoon porridge into their mouths. The food is plain, the ritual repetitive, the atmosphere subdued. And yet, in this ordinariness, something extraordinary occurs. Bodies are fed, souls are disciplined, culture is preserved. The boring meal becomes history. And here is the question that lingers. When we eat our own ordinary meals, our daily bread, our plain dishes, do we see only monotony? Or can we glimpse, as the monks did, the possibility that even the simplest food might carry meaning beyond itself? In midnight silence, monastery bells tolled through darkness, marking sacred hours, time kept not by clocks, but by echoes, prayer, and faithful rhythm. In the medieval world, time was not ruled by ticking hands on a dial. Mechanical clocks, as we know them, did not appear until the late Middle Ages, and even then they were rare curiosities, more monuments than everyday tools. For most of monastic history, time was measured not by machines but by rhythm, by bells, candles, water, and the steady cycle of sun and shadow. The monastery was a place where time mattered deeply, yet it was also a place without clocks. How then did monks know when to pray, when to eat, when to labour? The answer lies in the interplay of sound, sight, and discipline. Bells in the dark, candles dripping wax, and men who learned to feel the hours in their bones. The monastic hours, the rhythm of the monastery revolved around the Opus Dei, the work of God, which structured each day into fixed hours of prayer. The rule of St. Benedict prescribed 8 daily offices: matins, in the deep night, lauds, at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, spaced throughout the day, vespers, in the evening, and compline, before bed. These hours divided the day like the beats of a drum, each marked by prayer and chant. But without clocks, how could such precision be maintained? A monk could not simply glance at a dial. Instead, the monastery created its own methods of keeping time, bells as timekeepers. The most familiar tool was the bell. Large bells cast in bronze hung in towers or small belfries. When struck, their sound carried across cloisters, fields and villages. The bell called monks to prayer, roused them from sleep, marked the transition from work to meal. Its tone regulated life with a constancy that replaced the mechanical tick. Yet the bell itself needed a signal to be rung. A sacristan or porter, often one of the younger or more alert monks, was responsible for striking the bell at the appointed time. His task required vigilance, for if he erred, the whole rhythm of the house was disturbed. The bell did not measure time on its own, it amplified the discipline of those who kept watch. Candles and time by flame. In the absence of bells, or in the dead of night, candles served as crude clocks. Long candles were notched or marked at intervals, and as they burned, the passing of time could be measured by how far the wax melted. Some monasteries created elaborate candle clocks, with pins inserted into the wax that would fall noisily into a metal tray at set intervals. The sound would wake a monk, who would then rouse the community for prayer. It was an imprecise method, vulnerable to drafts, wax quality and human error, but it sufficed. To see wax drip, to mark the slow descent of flame, was to watch time itself dissolve before one's eyes. Water clocks. In some monasteries, especially those influenced by ancient learning, water clocks, clepsydras, were employed. These devices allowed water to drip steadily from one vessel to another, measuring the passage of time through volume. Though more consistent than candles, they required constant maintenance. Vessels had to be refilled, flow regulated, leaks mended. A water clock was not a machine that could run unattended, but a tool that demanded as much discipline as it provided. Still, in larger or wealthier monasteries, water clocks marked the night, helping to rouse monks at the appointed hour. The role of human timekeepers. Ultimately, the greatest measure of time was not instrument but person. Monks trained themselves to sense the hours by habit, by the position of the sun, by the length of shadows, by the rhythm of their prayers. Some sacristans became experts at gauging time intuitively, waking before dawn, calling the community at intervals that matched the rule. Others relied on wakeful brothers to stir at the right moments. Timekeeping was less a science than an art, embedded in the body's discipline. A monk who had chanted the same psalms at the same hours for decades needed no clock. His very breath and memory carried the rhythm of the day. Time and the outside world. The monastery's timekeeping also affected the world beyond its walls. Bells that called monks to prayer also marked time for villagers in nearby fields. Farmers measured their labour by the tolling of monastic bells, merchants by the sound that echoed across market squares. In this way, monasteries became the first public timekeepers of medieval Europe. Their bells governed not only cloisters but communities, embedding religious rhythm into daily life. The texture of monastic time. Life in a monastery, then, was not timeless. It was tightly bound by time, though measured differently than we might expect. Time was not counted in minutes and seconds, but in prayers, psalms, and the slow burning of the wax. It was flexible, imprecise, yet deeply ordered. A monk did not live by the precision of a clock, but by the repetition of routine. The passing of time was felt in hunger at noon, in the fatigue of night vigils, in the voice of the bell, in the flicker of the candle. And here is the unresolved thought. Did this looser, more bodily sense of time feel freer or heavier than our modern ticking clocks? Did the monk hearing the bell in the dark feel comfort in its rhythm or burden in its command? If bells were the heartbeat of the monastery, then the sacristan was the monk who kept that heart beating. His was a role of vigilance, discipline, and responsibility, for upon his attention rested the entire rhythm of monastic life. In this section, we look more closely at the human side of timekeeping, the sacristan's duty, the symbolism of bells, and how the constant need for precision in monastic time eventually nudged Europe toward mechanical clocks. The sacristan's burden. Every monastery appointed a sacristan, whose tasks included caring for the church, keeping vestments in order, maintaining candles, and, most importantly, ensuring the proper ringing of the bell. His vigilance mattered most at night. In the dark, when the community slept, it was the sacristan who kept watch for the hour of matins, the midnight office. He might rely on a candle clock, a water clock, or his own sense of time. However he judged the hour, he was expected to rise, strike the bell, and summon the brethren. An error of even an hour might disrupt the balance of prayer and labour. The responsibility weighed heavily. To rouse monks too early was to burden them with exhaustion. To call them too late was to cheat God of prayer. The sacristan's life was one of quiet pressure, measured not in glory but in accuracy. The symbolism of bells. The bell itself carried symbolic weight. Its ringing was more than a practical signal. It was the voice of God calling his servants. Medieval writers described the sound of bells as holy, their tones thought to drive away demons and sanctify the air. Bells were consecrated in ceremonies akin to baptism, washed with holy water, anointed with oil, given names. To hear the bell was to hear the sacred woven into daily life. For the monk, the toll was not mere sound, but command. Rise, pray, eat, labour, rest. For villagers beyond the monastery walls, the bell became a public marker of time, announcing dawn, midday, and evening. In both cloister and countryside, bells turned the passing of hours into acts of devotion. Sound over sight. The prominence of bells reveals something about the medieval experience of time. It was heard more than seen. Modern people rely on visual cues, hands of a clock, digits on a screen, but for centuries time arrived as sound. The toll of the bell, the fall of a pin in a candle, the drip of water into a vessel, these were the voices of time. Monks lived in a world where time summoned them, where the ear carried as much authority as the eye. To miss the sound was to miss the hour, and so the ear became trained, sensitive, alert to the bell's call, the problem of precision. Yet as monasteries grew larger, with hundreds of monks, the need for stricter precision became more pressing. When dozens or hundreds of men depended on one bell, the margin for error shrank. Monks who sang in choir demanded regularity, who worked in fields needed rhythm, who fasted required consistency. The imprecision of candles or water clocks became a burden. Sacristans struggled to maintain regularity across seasons, for nights lengthened and shortened, candles burned unevenly and water froze in winter. The desire for accurate, unceasing timekeeping grew steadily, nurtured within monastic walls. The monastery as an incubator for clocks. It is no accident that some of the first mechanical clocks in Europe appeared in monasteries and cathedrals. The monastic demand for regularity, for precision in the hours, created the conditions for innovation. By the 13th and 14th centuries, bell towers in major abbeys began to house mechanical devices that could strike the hours automatically. These early clocks were crude, their mechanisms driven by weights and regulated by verge and foliot escapements, but they freed the sacristan from constant vigilance. Bells could ring at regular intervals without human error. The rhythm of monastic life, once dependent on watchful eyes and burning candles, began to shift toward machinery. Time for the village. The monastery's embrace of bells and early clocks spilled into secular life. Villagers, long accustomed to the toll of monastic bells, now found themselves drawn into the new mechanical rhythm. Markets opened with bells, work paused with bells, councils met with bells. In this way, the monastery exported not just food and manuscripts, but time itself, embedding discipline into society. The bell that once summoned monks to matins now also told peasants when to till or rest, merchants when to trade, judges when to convene. The monastery's soundscape reshaped Europe's sense of time, the experience of monastic time. For the monk himself, the bell's voice was both comfort and command. It offered certainty in a world of imprecision, telling him when to rise, when to kneel, when to work, when to sleep. Yet, it also bound him. The bell was relentless, its call inescapable. Even in the dark of night, even in fatigue, its toll demanded obedience. The bell was freedom from guesswork, but also submission to rhythm. Its sound made life predictable, but it also made it rigid. To live under the bell was to surrender spontaneity. The monastery, with its bells, candles, and water clocks, did more than mark the passing hours. It prepared Europe for a new age of timekeeping, one in which the rhythm of prayer would give way to the tick of gears, and the sacred order of the hours would transform into the secular regularity of modern life. To conclude this story, we must look at the long-term legacy of monastic time, how it gave birth to mechanical clocks, how it reshaped society's relationship to time, and what was gained and lost when bells in the dark gave way to hands on a dial. From bells to machines. By the 13th century, the pressure for precision reached its breaking point. The old methods, candles dripping wax, water dripping into jars, sacristans gauging shadows, were no longer sufficient for great monasteries and cathedrals that needed to regulate large communities with consistency. Out of this demand came some of the first mechanical clocks. These devices, powered by weights and regulated by early escapements, struck bells at regular intervals without human oversight. Though crude, they represented a leap forward. Time could now be measured with the degree of uniformity impossible before. The earliest mechanical clocks were not designed for private use. They were monumental, installed in towers, their bells announcing the hours to entire towns. Monks still prayed when bells rang, but now the bell was rung by iron and gear rather than by weary sacristan. The human element receded. Machinery took its place. Monasteries had, unintentionally, ushered in the age of the machine. The spread of clock time as mechanical. Clocks spread from monasteries to towns. A profound shift occurred. Time was no longer tied to the rhythm of prayer, but to the rhythm of labour. Villages that had once looked to monastic bells to mark work now looked to town clocks that struck at regular intervals. Merchants timed markets by bells, guilds set hours for labour, courts met at scheduled times. The abstraction of time into regular mechanical units began here. Monks had sought only to regulate prayer, but in doing so they laid the foundation for Europe's new relationship with time: measurable, countable, divisible, uniform. The discipline of hours. For the monk, this change meant both continuity and loss. The hours remained, the same cycle of matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline, but now their call came with greater precision. No more reliance on a sleepy sacristan, no more uneven candle clocks. The bell rang true, every time. The discipline of obedience deepened, yet at the same time something human faded. The warmth of guesswork, the bodily sense of rhythm, the reliance on habit gave way to the cold regularity of gears. Time became less a rhythm felt, and more a schedule enforced. The village and the clock for villagers. The monastery's bells had once tied daily life to prayer, binding labour to worship. But as mechanical clocks spread, the bells became secular as well as sacred. The striking of the hours regulated markets, taxation, even military watches. The community became more punctual but also more bound. Just as monks had lived by the bell, so now did townsfolk. The monastery had exported not only discipline, but a model of life where time ruled. The weight of time, we, in the modern world, live in the shadow of this inheritance. Our lives are divided not by psalms, but by minutes, not by bells, but by the ticking of clocks and the glow of digital numbers. We obey alarms, schedules, deadlines. The monastery's rhythm has become our own, stripped of its sacredness, but not of its discipline. Monks once rose at midnight to chant matins because the bell called them. We rise at 6 because the alarm buzzes. The similarity is striking, but so is the difference. For the monk, the bell was the voice of God. For us, the alarm is the voice of obligation. Gentle rhythm, harsh discipline. So we are left with the paradox. Was the monastery's time gentler or harsher than our own? On the one hand, its rhythm was repetitive but humane. It followed the sun, bent to the seasons, allowed for longer sleep in winter, shorter in summer. Time was fluid, measured in prayers, not seconds. On the other hand, it was relentless. The bell rang even at midnight. Obedience demanded even in exhaustion. To live by bells was to live without escape. Yet to live by clocks is no less binding. The monastery may have rung the hours, but modern life ticks the minutes. Which is stricter? Which is freer? The legacy of bells. Even now, the legacy of monastic bells lingers. Church. Bells still toll in towns, marking hours even when no monks remain. We still observe hours in liturgy, still pause for moments of silence, still feel the tug of schedules that trace back to cloisters. The sacristan's midnight watch, the dripping of candles, the toll of bronze in the dark, they echo faintly in our alarms, our calendars, our timetables. We are, in a sense, still hearing bells in the dark. So let us return, one last time, to the monastery before the age of clocks. The cloister lies in shadow. A candle burns low, its wax pooling. A sacristan stirs, sensing the hour. He rises, strikes the great bell. Its voice carries into dormitory and village, into dream and waking. Monks rise, weary but obedient, filing into the church. The sound fades into silence, leaving only the rhythm of chant in the night. This was time before clocks, not measured by machines but by flame, water, sound, and habit. It was boring, perhaps. It was repetitive. But it was also profound. And here is the final thought. Do we bound now to ticking minutes, envy the monks who lived by bells and shadows? Or do we pity them for their endless obedience to sound in the dark? On cold stone floors and straw-filled beds, monks rested in silence, their dormitories echoing with prayers, discipline, and the hush of centuries. When we imagine the medieval monastery, we may think first of the church with its soaring arches, or the cloister with its quiet garden. Yet just as central to monastic life was the dormitory, the place where monks slept, or tried to. Far from being a private refuge, the dormitory was a communal space, stark in design, uncomfortable by modern standards but essential to the discipline of the rule. To understand the daily life of a monk, we must step inside the cold stone hall, where sleep came not as comfort, but as obedience. The architecture of the dormitory. The monastic dormitory was usually a long rectangular hall, built of stone, with a high timbered roof. Windows were few and small, admitting little light. Floors were often bare stone, though in some houses wooden planks were laid. Against the walls, in rows, were placed simple pallets, straw mattresses on wooden frames, sometimes little more than mats on the floor. There were no curtains, no partitions, no privacy. A monk slept beside his brothers as he prayed beside them, ate beside them, worked beside them. The dormitory was an extension of the cloister's communal ideal. No man apart, all men together. Cold was constant. Stone walls retained the chill of winter. and the thin coverings offered little protection. Monks slept fully clothed in their habits, sometimes with hoods pulled over their heads, relying on body heat and straw for warmth. Fires were rare, forbidden in most dormitories for fear of sparks. The breath of dozens of men rose into the rafters, mingling with the draughts that crept through cracks. Winter nights were long and sleep was often restless. To endure the dormitory was to endure discomfort as part of devotion. The rhythm of sleep, the rule of St. Benedict, prescribed a life punctuated by prayer, and the dormitory was no exception. Monks did not sleep through the night. They retired after Compline, the last office of the evening, but were roused at midnight for matins. Bells or knocks woke them, and they shuffled from pallets to church in silence, chanting psalms in the dark. After matins, they might return for a few hours' rest before Lauds at dawn. This broken sleep was habitual, shaping their bodies and minds. To a modern sleeper, it would feel exhausting. To the monk, it was obedience. Rest, not for comfort, but to sustain prayer. Silence and surveillance. In the dormitory, silence reigned as strictly as in the cloister. Conversation was forbidden. Even whispers could draw rebuke. The monk was expected to lie quietly, eyes closed, thoughts turned to God. Sleep was not an escape from discipline, but a continuation of it. Silence extended into the night, ensuring that no man disturbed another. Surveillance reinforced this silence. Senior monks or designated officials kept watch, ensuring rules were kept. No one was left entirely alone, even in sleep. Privacy did not exist. Obedience was constant, the vulnerability of the body. Yet despite rules and ideals, the dormitory was also the place where the human body made its needs known. Monks grew sick, coughed in the night, shifted on straw beds, rose to relieve themselves. Chamber pots were kept in corners or beneath pallets, emptied in the morning. Illness was common. Cold stone, thin bedding, and draughty air weakened bodies. Infirmaries were sometimes provided for the sick, where rules were relaxed, but most endured hardship in the common dormitory. The contrast between the monastery's spiritual aspirations and its physical discomforts was stark. To live as a monk was to experience both at once. The spiritual meaning of sleep. In monastic thought, sleep was not simply rest. It was a reminder of death, a rehearsal for the eternal rest of the soul. To lie down beside one's brothers row on row was to imagine the graveyard, where bodies would one day lie side by side. Waking for matins was a rehearsal for the resurrection, rising from the sleep of death at God's call. The dormitory thus carried symbolic weight. Every night was a small death, every dawn a reminder of life renewed. By stripping sleep of comfort, the rule gave it meaning as discipline and devotion. The contrast with the world. Outside. To peasants or nobles, the dormitory might have seemed strange. Villagers slept in cottages with families, animals, and fire for warmth. Nobles slept in chambers with curtains, servants, and feather beds. Monks, by contrast, chose austerity. Cold halls, straw bedding, no privacy. The difference was deliberate. The dormitory was not meant to rival the world's comfort, but to reject it. To sleep poorly was a form of sacrifice, a small offering, of discomfort in pursuit of holiness. Where the world sought rest, the monastery sought vigilance. And yet, we must ask, did every monk truly find holiness in such conditions? Or did some lie awake on their straw pallets, shivering in the draught, longing for warmth, whispering in their hearts that perhaps this discipline felt more like hardship than sanctity? The monastic dormitory, stark as it was not merely a place to lie down. It was a machine of discipline, carefully designed to regulate the body, the community, and the soul. In this section, we move from the symbolic to the practical. How monks were roused from sleep, how they prepared for prayer, how their bodily needs were managed in the communal hall, and how this simple arrangement shaped the fabric of daily life. The midnight rising sleep in the dormitory was never uninterrupted. The bell, or the hand of the sacristan, roused the monks around midnight for the night office, matins. In the dark they stirred on their straw pallets, pulling hoods over their heads against the chill. No candlelight was wasted unless necessary. The moon, or a single lamp, often provided all the light. They rose in silence, slipping from bed as though answering a command. The line of monks moved together from dormitory to church, their procession a nightly rhythm. To wake at midnight, chant psalms for an hour or more, and return to bed for a short rest before dawn was not natural, but it was routine. The dormitory was the training ground for this broken pattern of sleep, endured every night for years. Communal order. The arrangement of beds reinforced unity. In many Benedictine and Cistercian houses, monks slept side by side in rows, heads aligned, feet aligned, no partitions between them. This created order and discouraged idleness. No man could claim a private corner. No man could indulge in sloth unnoticed. The dormitory made visible the vow of community. As they prayed together, ate together, so they also slept together. Even in dreams, they were a body bound in discipline. In some later monasteries, especially by the 14th century, partitions or small cubicles were introduced, but in earlier centuries the open hall was the norm. Privacy was seen as dangerous, opening the door to idleness, temptation, or disobedience. The communal dormitory was not merely practical, it was moral. The latrine's human need could not be denied, and so monasteries constructed latrines adjacent to or near the dormitory. Known in some houses as the necessarium, these were often long stone chambers with running water beneath, carried away by channels. Monks could relieve themselves in order, seated side by side just as they slept side by side. Again, privacy was minimal. The latrine was part of the same communal ideal. No part of life was exempt from order and discipline. To relieve oneself was no less regulated than to pray. In winter, the latrines were bitterly cold, the stone biting, the water freezing at the edges, yet they were an advance over peasant cottages, where waste often accumulated indoors. Washing and bodily care. Bathing was infrequent, but washing was regular. Basins or troughs of water were provided for monks to wash hands and faces in the morning, often in a room adjacent to the dormitory. The water was cold, bracing, and in winter a form of penance in itself. The rule of Benedict permitted bathing only sparingly, usually for the sick. Cleanliness was valued, but indulgence was not. To wash the face with cold water to endure discomfort was part of the discipline. The dormitory, with its attached washing places, was not simply where the body rested, but where it was trained to accept hardship, the role of the novice. For novices, the dormitory was a place of testing. The discipline of silence, the rigours of midnight rising, the endurance of cold, these tested the resolve of the newcomer. Many records describe novices whispering at night, laughing or struggling to wake. Their failures were noted, their penances assigned. The dormitory was a classroom of obedience, where young men learned the seriousness of their vows. To endure the cold stone and straw was to begin the lifelong process of conversion of life, community and vulnerability. And yet, within this communal severity lay vulnerability. To sleep side by side was to see one another's weakness. A monk who coughed through the night, who shifted restlessly, who snored loudly, he could not hide it. Illness was visible, fatigue was obvious. The dormitory laid bare the fragility of the human body. Brothers endured one another's weaknesses, sometimes with patience, sometimes with irritation. In this way, the dormitory shaped not only discipline but humility. Every monk was reminded nightly that he was as weak as his brother. The dormitory and the idea of death. There was also a haunting resemblance between the dormitory and the graveyard. Rows of beds resembled rows of graves. Silence at night resembled the silence of death. To rise at the bell for matins was like rising at the Last Judgment. Writers of the Middle Ages often drew this parallel, seeing the dormitory as a rehearsal for eternity. To sleep was to surrender the body, to wake was to receive it again. The cold stone, the shared silence, the lack of privacy, all pointed beyond earthly comfort to the reality of mortality. The monk was trained to see every night's rest as a reminder of his final rest. Tension between ideal and reality. But as with so much in monastic life, the ideal was not always the reality. Some monks whispered in the night, some smuggled food into the dormitory, some failed to rise for matins, feigning illness or fatigue. Chroniclers note these lapses with disapproval, but they remind us that monks were human. The cold stone, the thin straw, the broken sleep, all took their toll. The dormitory was meant to be a place of sanctity, but it was also a place of weakness. The tension between aspiration and reality was never absent. The dormitory, with its cold stone, straw pallets, and communal silence, may seem a detail of monastic life too small to matter. Yet it shaped not only the daily experience of countless monks, but also left a lasting legacy in the architecture, education, and ideals of community life that followed. To understand its impact, we must consider both what it meant within the monastery and how its patterns echoed beyond cloister walls. The dormitory as discipline made stone. The dormitory embodied the rule's vision of communal living. In it, individuality was stripped away. There were no private chambers, no locked doors, no decorated spaces. Every man slept in the same way, with the same bedding, at the same hours, under the same silence. This was discipline translated into architecture. The stone walls did not merely enclose men, they enforced equality and obedience. The dormitory was as much a teacher as the abbot. Its coldness taught endurance, its openness taught humility, its routine taught obedience. It was boring, harsh, repetitive, but also purposeful. Influence on monastic architecture. The design of dormitories spread widely. Benedictine and Cistercian models, with long communal halls and adjacent latrines, influenced the building of monasteries across Europe. Over time, variations emerged. Some orders introduced cubicles for senior monks, some created smaller dormitories for different groups. But the basic idea of shared sleeping quarters remained central to the monastic ideal. The architecture of discipline, rows of beds in cold halls, came to define what it meant to live under the rule. From monasteries to universities. One of the most lasting legacies of the monastic dormitory was its influence on universities. When medieval universities arose in the 12th and 13th centuries, many adopted residential colleges modelled on monasteries. Students lived together in halls, slept in shared quarters or small cells, ate in communal refectories, and followed rules of silence and study. The very idea of the dormitory in schools and universities is a direct descendant of the monastic hall. Though softened with time, the principle remained: to live together in discipline, to shape the young through shared life. The cold stone of the monastery became the prototype for the college quadrangle, the dormitory as symbol of equality. The dormitory also symbolised equality. Nobles who entered monasteries slept beside peasants. The wealthy lay on straw like the poor. Status dissolved in the dormitory, at least in theory. In practice, exceptions arose. Abbots and priors often had private chambers, but the ideal endured. For many monks, the dormitory was the one place where worldly rank was stripped away. Its coldness was democratic, its austerity unifying. The dormitory and the idea of communal life beyond its walls, the dormitory helped shape the very idea of communal living. Monks who endured it learned to accept discomfort, to tolerate neighbours, to subordinate personal desire to group need. These lessons were carried into later institutions: hospitals, military barracks, seminaries and schools. Whenever men and women were gathered to live in common, echoes of the monastic dormitory reappeared. Even modern boarding schools and universities owe something to those cold stone halls. The practice of regulating sleep, meals and study in a shared environment began in the monastery. The fragility of the body. Yet for all its symbolism, the dormitory also revealed the body's limits. Illness spread easily in crowded halls, cold weakened the sick, snores, coughs, and restlessness tested patients. Infirmaries eventually developed as necessary supplements, acknowledging that not all could endure the discipline. The dormitory thus forced monasteries to confront the tension between ideal and reality. It was a place of obedience, but also a place where frailty showed itself most clearly. The very structure that symbolized strength also revealed weakness. The dormitory's spiritual legacy. Spiritually, the dormitory reminded monks of mortality. To lie in rows of beds was to imagine lying in rows of graves. To wake at matins was to rehearse the resurrection. The symbolism was intentional, reinforcing humility and readiness for death. Monastic writers often urged brothers to sleep as though you were to rise no more, and rise as though you were rising to judgment. In this sense, the dormitory was not merely about rest. It was about preparing for eternity. Its cold stone and straw were reminders that comfort in this life was fleeting. Modern reflections. Today, when we hear the word dormitory, we think of schools, universities or military barracks, not monasteries. yet the root is the same. The monastic dormitory set the precedent. Shared space, minimal comfort, discipline through architecture. Though softened with mattresses, privacy and heat, the principle of shaping individuals through communal living endures, and yet, our modern dormitories rarely carry the spiritual weight of their ancestors. What monks saw as preparation for eternity, we see as temporary inconvenience. The cold stone and straw are gone, but the lesson remains. The way we sleep shapes the way we live. So picture the dormitory once more. The long hall, the rows of straw pallets, the silence broken only by breath. In the dark, a bell rings. Brothers stir, rise, move as one. The dormitory has done its work. It has bound them together, stripped them of comfort, reminded them of mortality. It is boring, cold, even harsh, but it is also meaningful. And here is the thought to carry forward. When we strip life of comfort, do we discover discipline, or do we simply suffer? Was the monastic dormitory a path to holiness, or merely a hall of hardship? The answer perhaps lies in how one endures the cold stone and straw,